we all get better. So we are now currently wrapping up our annual financial audit, which staff is hard at work across the street doing that. And we recently went through the what's called an IV&V, Independent Validation and Verification, for our IT system, the new modernized system that the city is currently implementing. We'll continue as well to do regular IV&V analysis of this IT program through the implementation, which it'll last for at least another 6 months for the finance and HR section, and then continue on after that for the other components of the IT system. What other types of audits can we do? We can do a forensic audit to make sure that there has been no fraud. We can do performance and compliance audits of our programs to make sure we're complying with federal, state, local rules and regs. We can do operational audits. So something that we are in the middle of planning is an operational review of our police department. Are we maximizing our resources? Do we have the right staffing patterns? We just issued a classification and compensation study of the city yesterday, so that's essentially an operational review of our HR system. Do we have the right human capital classifications in the city, and are we compensating at the appropriate levels to attract and retain talented and qualified staff? So audits can really span a wide variety of areas, but of course, I'm concerned about the financial audits and the compliance audits for our city. I spoke a bit about what you all have heard in the newspapers called ERP, Enterprise Resource Planning. It's an enterprise-wide financial, human capital, and land use system. The system that the city chose to go with is Tyler Munis for financials and HCM, and InterGov for land use. So the idea with this new system is that we have a modernized system where we are able to facilitate internal controls. So for example, user access. It's very basic, but what I am able to do as the finance director should be very, very different than what in the system than what the HR director is able to do in the system. So at that most basic level, there needs to be separation of access and duties and responsibilities within our IT systems as well. So we are currently managing within our current system those access and those rights and those restrictions to the best of the abilities of the system. But with this new system, I don't know if any of you have worked with the state, but their enterprise-wide system that they implemented about a decade ago is called SHARE. And that had very clearly defined user roles and access. And that was something that they also, with the implementation of that system over a decade ago, also struggled with. For the first few months of that implementation, we joked that SHARE stood for Share Your Money because they hadn't quite figured out the right roles and responsibilities of that system. But through the course of the implementation and further testing, they were able to refine that. So it's important. It's very, very important for a system to be able to restrict access for certain areas and to allow the appropriate access for the users. In addition with, and I think this probably speaks to some of the issues that were raised in the audits of the park bond back in 2008, was the appropriate controls in the system. So that is something that is extremely important. As far as internal controls go, another very basic, and I'm probably getting too much into the weeds with these details, but journal entry is something where you're reallocating funding or you're moving money around in your financial system. Well, some organizations have the same person approving, entering those journal entries and approving those journal entries. So with the implementation when we brought in our controller, she started to implement those internal controls where others in the organization are entering the journal entries to move money around, and then she goes through the backup, the justification essentially for the need for that transaction, and then she approves it. So and those are user-defined roles, user-appropriate roles, and something that we will also have in the new system as well. Let's see. Transparency and public reports. I'm so glad that Rennie talked about this. This is something that is extremely important to me. So I worked, as Chris mentioned, in the legislature, the Legislative Finance Committee, and we worked very hard and diligently to produce reports for the committee members. But we often heard that criticism is that we didn't then provide the same types of reports that we provided to the legislators, to the public, or to the community. And more information, especially in the 21st century, as all of us have access on the devices in our hands to information. It's really important for us to be informing the community at a regular interval and in an easily understandable way of the financial transactions in the city. So our team is now doing quarterly reports to the Finance Committee which are posted on the website, and they don't disappear after the hearing, but they stay on there. But I think it's a great feedback to actually make copies of those reports and hand them out at the meeting, so you can follow through page by page as we're presenting the report. There's much more that we can do in this area, especially since we have just issued a $20 million GRT bond. What the Finance Committee and the governing body has requested of staff is to do regular reporting on the status of those projects. So various projects, from Parks and Rec projects to IT to software projects to public safety. For example, the public safety radio system, or the new fire station number 2 on the south side. And so our new public works director is putting together a very easily readable report that will be accompanied by financials to inform the public of where the status of those projects are on a quarterly basis. So it's really a matter of making government and what we do every day easily accessible, easily digestible to the public. And that's very important to me personally. Also using data to drive those decisions. It's something that once we get these IT systems in place, once we start to move towards a modernized system, we'll be able to then share the data that we are using to make those decisions. So that was important with the classification and compensation study, that we share there's over 475 different classifications in different job titles, essentially, throughout the city. And then the consultant that we hired reduced those to 330 classifications. But we made sure that to present not just the consultant's report, but the data behind it to show the 475 different classifications, and then where they would end up in the new proposed, the recommended structure. So it's important not only to understand, what the decisions that the governing body or the staff is recommending, but the data behind those decisions as well. I think that about covers it for me, so I will pass it on.
Richard?
Great. First of all, thank you for having us here today. It's an honor to display our opinions about transparency and responsibility and accountability. Infrastructure in parks is a nebulous term. Is turf infrastructure? Does it last forever? Trees, flowers, playgrounds, sidewalks, parking lots, buildings. All of this comprises the park system that Santa Fe enjoys. And it's a reason that I answered the call of recruitment from Ike Pino to come consider the failures of the 2008 bond issue and how we can address those immediately. This was in 2014, 2 years into the 2012 bond. About 80% of those funds had been expended, and about 60% of the goals had been achieved. So these are numbers that I'm spouting from memory. As you notice, I carry no paper. I write down as little as possible. It's a trick I learned from many years in public service. The idea that I would say something today that you would revisit in the future, I carry with great gravity and will honor every commitment I make to the citizens of Santa Fe and to the executive staff of the city. We bring this sentiment to the front line through superintendents and supervisors that your word is really the only thing that you carry with you through life. Everything else is ephemeral or at best fleeting. There is the accumulation of wealth in our culture, but beyond that, there's very little you carry with you except your word and the things that you've learned along the way. So what do you learn from sailing, fishing, and beachcombing? Sometimes you catch fish, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you have favorable breeze, sometimes you don't. What do you learn from total quality management and project management? Oh man, managing expectations is the only difficulty in applying funds and the building of vertical and horizontal assets. So let's touch on that briefly. Managing expectations is best done through regular reporting of progress, of realized value and project construction, percentages of completion. All of these things can be delivered to the public on a regular basis in a format that is comfortable for them, and that is the objective, is to manage expectations throughout a project so you don't get to the 90% and then have to break the bad news. We did not achieve all of the goals we had. We expended monies where we did not alert you to these expenditures. So the idea is that if you have a packaged software, as Mary intimates, for example, project management in Microsoft, you can set up these reporting benchmarks and meet the expectations of the end user continually throughout the project. The idea that we would get to the end of the bond and then announce we succeeded or we failed is going to be relatively disappointing, I found. So if we alert the community, the stockholders as we call them, the stakeholders, if we alert them to surprises, to field change orders, to change of course, then we will avoid some of these disappointing revelations at the very end of the project. The other thing that we learn in life is that we accept these disappointments and then learn lessons from them. The idea that I don't write anything down is not completely true. What I do is write down the things I hear from other people that make sense to me. Peter Drucker, Tom Peters, a number of economists that have led us into the light of a new day, as Mary intimates as well. In the 21st century, there's really no reason to reinvent accounting principles. There are minor tweaking to accounting systems, but for the most part, we use double entry bookkeeping. We use control methods through a hierarchy of roles and responsibilities, just as you would in project management. So the idea of transparency is questionable. If it goes back to Otto Bismarck's statement that if it's like sausage making, maybe people really don't want to know how we make decisions. So we look to a term, illumination. If we can illuminate the decision-making process and the changes to the established objectives and goals of a project, and keep people apprised to where we are in completion of the project and how the dollars are expended, then I believe that we can remove some of the vagaries, cloudiness, and uncertainty within the public. And that is our objective, is to make sure the citizens of Santa Fe have confidence in our abilities and reap the benefits of these well-invested dollars. Having said that, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Thank you, Richard. So, you know, I think you make a good point, Richard. There's no reason to reinvent these processes. And Mary, perhaps this is a little bit of a question more for you. You know, it seems like we have struggled over the years, you know, city government, not just the city of Santa Fe, you know, it's throughout at least New Mexico, if I read the local papers, we struggle, we suffer from not having had policies, procedures, controls. Are there standards for these sort of thing? Are there organizations that produce kind of generally accepted standards that we can all follow without having to try to invent these themselves? And maybe you could talk about that a little.
So yes, there are generally accepted best practices. There are, each jurisdiction is very different though. So the rules that and the state laws or local laws that applied in Massachusetts and Boston are very different than what governs us here in New Mexico. So one specific example is we have written policies and procedures surrounding grants, which is also an area of opportunity for us in the city to seek additional grant funding from the federal government, from states, from other organizations. And so we have these set policies, these set rules that we need to be following, but then there was a change. There was a change in a local ordinance that increased the city manager's approval level from 50,000 to 60,000. That was then never made throughout every single policy, procedural document that we had in the city. So I think as the governing body continues to weigh in on policy and change ordinances, we need to be nimble enough as a government to then see how does that affect all of our policies and procedures and then make those changes accordingly. And I'm also a big fan of education. So then it's not just, put something into a document and then distribute, but it's actively going out and training our city employees as well as the community on what these changes are and what they mean for the community as well.
Thank you. So the three of you have a lot of experience in, at least half a dozen municipalities. Where do you put Santa Fe at this point in our size, growth, et cetera, as compared to what you see other municipalities doing? Are we way behind the curve, or are we kind of an understandable level of struggle and growth? Question for all three of you.
Take it, Zubin. So Santa Fe with 80,000 citizens, 72 parks, 4,000 acres of open space, and as many recreational opportunities as any part of the United States of America. Where does it sit in comparison? One of the things that we ask our previous city manager when comparing to cities of comparable size, can we look to state capitals? Can we look to art centers? Can we look to educational centers? In other words, we don't really compare well with Lubbock or, Tucumcari, but we do really represent more an Austin, Boulder, San Francisco, Berkeley type of community, and that may be what we should be looking at. I think it's an excellent question. How do we compare to other metropolitan areas? One of the things I note about New Mexico is a combination of cultural preservation and modernization. And this is a difficult wire to walk, and the perils are evident. But when you have streets that are 12 feet wide, you must consider adapting your traffic patterns to that. When you have a good percentage of the population riding bikes to work, school, and other opportunities, you have to look to that. All of these things integrated in the community of Santa Fe, to me, are something to be very proud of. It's a beacon for those that come behind us, that we have taken the painful thought process to that level where we try to address every single citizen's concerns and desires. And that in itself has a reward and challenge relationship that I find very rewarding personally. And having said that, I'll ask Mary what she thinks about the city of Santa Fe.
I think no matter where you live, no matter what community you live in, that we should aspire to greatness. We should aspire to achieving progress. Councillor Lindell mentioned this to me this past week, that it's not perfection, it's progress. So as long as we continue to see progress, whether it is in our professional goals, our goals as a city to improve, or our personal goals, I think that really resonated with me when she mentioned that. So I think as I mentioned before, I'm a big fan of audits. It really gives us an independent analysis of how we can do better. And as long as we are constantly seeing movement and progress towards improving those goals, I think that is what we can measure ourselves against.
Very diplomatic.
The state of Nevada, which I'm the most familiar with, has a capital city about this size. It's in the mountains. Its recreation opportunities are about the same. Probably the amount of parks and recreation and that sort of thing they provide for their citizens is substantially less. Their financial management is today probably a bit better than it was before the new team came on here, but it went through roughly the same sort of problems a while back because you know, the times change, and what was an adequate amount of disclosure and what was an adequate amount of controls has changed over the years considerably. So in that regard, I'd say it's, and I'm familiar with some other towns of about the same size in Nevada and some of it a lot bigger, but given the finances it had and the things it had to work with and the ways times do change, probably fits in about average among them. I do want to make one remark. If you want to see an example of what we're talking about, go look at the justification for the 2 park bond issues and the literature describing them that the city put out in the detail, and then look at the justification and the literature put out for the 2018 GRT bond project. The improvement is terrific. There's a night and day comparison with what you get for disclosures. The current one has it by topics, by purpose, by sources of money, by the amount expected to be spent, and then a detailed narrative on each of the projects. So there's something to judge them by when things get done. And they tell you what happens if it's not done or if the money's moved, so you can judge if they take the money from one project and put it into another, the likely consequences of that change. And that's something we just didn't used to see. And if this sort of thing is continued and reporting is continued, I think it will help a lot with the problem.
Thank you. So, you know, we'd had a little discussion of what's capital, what's infrastructure, radios, grass, et cetera. You know, I think when I got my sample ballot last month, I'm looking at it and saying, really, we're bonding for school buses? What are there standards, are there rules of thumb, et cetera? How do you decide when something infrastructure we're going to bond for versus something we just have to pay for at a general fund? Whoever wants to answer that.
Give it to the accountant.
That's a really good question, and it's actually something we asked as we were going through the GRT bond review, the projects for the GRT bond review. I think you have to take a step back and look at the finances of an organization overall. What are your revenue sources, and how are you spending those? And there's a set pie. I feel like I'm a broken record because I keep repeating this. There's a set pot of money that we have, and we have to make sure that we are being very prudent and judicious when we are allocating the pieces of that pie out. So making sure that we have the data to prove that the programs we are investing in are achieving the outcomes that we set forth. And for those programs that are not achieving those outcomes, then we need to be divesting in those programs and reinvesting in something that will achieve the goals, whether it's in parks and recreation or in public safety. It's very important for us to rely on the data to make those decisions. So when we're looking at our entire finances, unless if we are going to be considering a slew of revenue options, we have a set pie, and we have to be able to manage within that. And so I think when we were reviewing the GRT bond, the figure that kept coming up was closer to $250 million in deferred maintenance for the city. So within that set pie, and as that set pie, expands a little bit or shrinks a little bit through our economic boom and bust cycle, we have to be able to make those hard decisions to say we are going to carve a piece out for a regular replacement of vehicles, a regular replacement of IT equipment, those things that we shouldn't be relying on bonding necessarily for. But those decisions are hard to make, especially as we've seen in the last decade with the recession. You're weighing decisions. Do I lay personnel off, or do I cut back on my vehicle replacement schedule? And so a lot of times, because of the personal impact, the vehicle replacement or the computer replacement schedules are the first ones to be decreased or eliminated in its entirety. And so that is, I think it's a struggle as we go through the economic cycle. So really taking a look at our tax base and taking a look at our revenues to make sure that we're setting ourselves up for success. Taking a look at things that we can do better in the city, like a rainy day fund, making sure that during good times that we are growing that rainy day fund to then sustain us in the economic downturn, so we don't have to make those very difficult decisions.
And are there legal strictures? If we're going to say we've completely run out of money and we need to float a bond to buy more toner for our printers, is that a pure policy decision for City Council, or are there legal standards applicable?
There are legal standards, and I think Rennie did a really good job of very, generally describing what is considered infrastructure.
Please.
Yeah, I can amplify a little bit more. There are rules of thumb that are not necessarily hard and fast, but for example, if you're not bonding for more or less permanent items and items of a capital nature, and undoubtedly a school bus is a thing, as is toner, but of course a school bus, it can last 5 years, it can last 10 years, it can last 20 with the proper care. So it's those kind of things are a little bit more at the margin, but you're in danger of losing your deductibility of your muni bonds if you don't qualify. But bond counsel and bond advisors and the salespeople and the rating people keep a pretty good eye on those things. And they tend to, if it's not all for short-lived items, they tend to be a little more liberal than they are otherwise, if a lot of it's going to be permanent. But those are the issues, and over the years, I think probably because of financial problems, they've become a little bit more liberal with them. But yes, there are limits, and they are defined. There's case law, and it tends to vary a little bit. But I'd say anything under 5 years, anything that's obviously simply an ordinary maintenance item or an ordinary replacement item is definitely out, and then you kind of take it from there.
Okay, thank you. So, Mary, you talked about kind of, I guess, separation of access in the IT system, second eyes, that sort of thing. The conventional wisdom, at least, has traditionally been that we've kind of had some choke points at the city, like so-and-so is the only person who knows how to use this system or to access this account or whatever. And, number one, nothing can happen if they're out that day. Number two, you got to kind of trust that they're doing it right with no real verification of the trust. Can you talk about how, that certainly one aspect of the IT system is kind of limiting eyeballs, but how are we addressing getting away from an IT system of men and becoming an IT system of IT?
That's a really good question. That's something that the city continues to be a challenge for the city. In my office alone, there's been, so one person would know how to do a particular function. So over the course of the last 4 months, what I've asked is for documentation to be written, and we've had several people that are also retiring as well. And this happens in organizations, as you rise up in the organization and then you get ready for retirement, a lot of things, institutional knowledge that you've carried with you through your tenure at the organization. So I've asked for staff who are either getting ready to retire or staff that is the only person in the organization that knows how to do one particular function to start writing those functions down, kind of a step-by-step. If I am new to the grant process, I need to be able to go in and from start to finish understand how to complete this person's duties and responsibilities. So I think that's the first step. The second step is then cross-training, and to be able to have an organization where if someone is out for a day or for a week, because all of our employees need to have that R&R time, that someone else would be able to step in and would have already been trained in that. So something maybe organizations haven't prioritized before, but I recognize the value of that also in career growth, as an employee, to be able to learn additional skills is very helpful in your own career development and your own career path as well.
Thank you. Kind of related question, and I don't mean to pick on you. It's just you're the one who knows these things. So you talk about reorganizing, a staff reorganization at the city, and I think there's a lot of people in this room who kind of roll their eyes and say, "Here we go again," because we do it a lot, regularly. I think that there's at least a feeling that we establish jobs to fit the people we have at the time, the skills and interests that they have. And how can, going forward, we ensure that we figure out what positions are needed, we establish those positions, and then we hire people who can do those jobs? Mm-hmm. Is that something you're working on?
So I think every organization that I've worked in has had that challenge where you have someone with a particular skill set or a particular talent, and then you assign roles and responsibilities accordingly. So I don't think we're unique in that way. That's definitely a challenge for Santa Fe. I mentioned briefly about the classification and compensation study. It's something that shouldn't just be, I think there have been 3 done in the last 13 years. It's not something that should sit on a shelf. It's something that we need to continually look at in an organization, because the finance department of 10 years ago isn't sufficient. The organization of a finance department 10 years ago, although the basics are still the same and aren't going to change, there are certain skills that you do need to have now and certain positions that you would need to have now that might not have been required 10 or 20 years ago. So for example, I've been talking a lot about data and data-driving decisions. There's been a trend over the last few decades to move towards performance-based budgeting. Here at the city of Santa Fe adopted results-based accountability, essentially, measuring how you're spending your dollars. What are the outcomes that these investments are achieving? We didn't necessarily do that last year or the year before, or 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So we need to be able to create or have positions for that program, people who are able to analyze that type of data and then make recommendations on that. So right now that is spread out within all of our departments, but we need to look at where that would be best centralized in our city as well. So your basic functions aren't going to change. You're always going to have AP, AR. You should always have a controller in your organization. You should always have someone who is doing an internal audit as well. It's also a change that the city has gone through recently. Last year, they decided to outsource the internal audit function. So we've hired a company out of Colorado to perform a risk assessment for the city and develop an audit plan. So we now have the audit plan, and they will also be performing one audit for the city.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah,
please, if
yes,
anyone else
please.
has
May I
anything
speak
to
to
add
this
before we
from
go
the
to questions?
management perspective? So in years past, we've used personnel management within the union environment as the driver of personnel decisions and goal setting, and even in the bond execution, as mentioned earlier, maintaining the workforce at the present or the previous levels was one of the objectives not stated in the bond issue, much to my surprise. So we have the opportunity as Mary intimated, to recognize best management practices that are adapted throughout our discipline, which is the green science or the green industry. At that point, we have the choice to move to a skill management, as Mary talked about, skill set management, as opposed to personnel management. The objectives here are not contrary to the objectives of the union, which is full employment and compensation and equity. Rather, it is an opportunity for the individual employee to seek a path that may differ from the next guy in the truck, man or woman. We're looking forward to hiring our first female park maintenance worker under my tenure any day now. Sorry, sidebar. So the idea that we can establish skills required to meet the best management practice objectives of our science is exciting. We are gathering consensus throughout the city. It is a part of enterprise resource planning or enterprise resource management that a work order system reflects not only the quantity of work, but rather the quality of work, so that the dollars that we spend on labor are not repeated continuously and unsustainably, but rather we achieve goals and put those aside, revisit them on a periodic basis through best management practices, but we don't consistently do or constantly do the practices that do not achieve our goals and do not meet the expectations of the public. So from a manager's point of view, the future holds these opportunities to adapt best management practices, skill set management, and achieve goals that everyone agrees with.
Thank you. Anyone else want to add anything before we go to questions? All right, so do we have any questions or comments? Don't be shy, raise a hand.
Thank you, Chris. It's good to hear that the city is making its procedures more visible, if not transparent. But my question is, what's actually happened to infrastructure? And have we gotten back to where we should have been before the funds were spent on other things? And how are we doing in terms of the checklist of key infrastructure efforts by the city, roads, parks, et cetera? How are we doing in that?
Better. If I may address the 2008 bond issue, this was somewhat of a, let's see, what's the term for it? Gosh, don't want to offend anybody, but somewhat amateurs in the way that the improvements to parks were listed and then valued, i.e. a cost was attributed to each thing we were going to achieve in a park. First of all, there were considerations that a professional would have taken, for example, accessibility. One of the big surprises that I had to discuss with POSAC, the Park and Open Space Advisory Committee, was that you cannot add value to a flat structure like a sidewalk or a parking lot without ensuring accessibility to a set standard. As Mary mentioned earlier, we don't have to invent how many accessible parking spaces we put in a parking lot. The standards are well established since 1992. That was a long time ago. So why wasn't accessibility considered in the bond issue as a major cost? Every time we add value to a park, we have to increase the accessibility. This was a painful subject, and yet it was not malfeasance, misappropriation. It was attention to the law. And was this a mistake? Was this a, renegade action? No, it wasn't. Did people catch flack for this? Yes, we did. Was it deserved? No, it wasn't. So these are issues that do not reveal in an audit. These are decisions, as we mentioned earlier. These field change orders should have been publicized. They were taken to council. They were approved. and yet it was a major cost to the bond that wasn't really publicly discussed.
But I'm asking for a current scorecard.
Well,
Current scorecard,
as
he said.
Rennie, I hate to dominate this part because I'm just a elevated tree trimmer. But as Rennie pointed up, the process of explaining, describing, and predicting what will happen during the bond, this GRT bond issue, was exhaustive. We were pulled out of the field on more than one occasion to add information, to add maps, to add dimensions to the places we were going to do work. And all of this adds up to a body of information that is consumable, digestible, and actionable. And I think it's a successful process, and I look forward to a future bond issue, perhaps not during my career tenure, but I hope that the citizens of Santa Fe will allow parks to package some bond improvements and ask their permission to seek these funds.
And I think you might have addressed it, but any plans for our next parks bond issue?
We have deferred maintenance, as mentioned earlier. The Midtown campus comes with its own set of challenges. And then, of course, there are changes in demand for park services. For example, when I got into this business, it was basically picnicking and throwing the Frisbee to the dog. Organized sports moved out of schools and into recreation, municipal recreation programs, which dragged park operations along. We had to get better at growing turf. We had to get better at maintaining playgrounds. I'm sure all of you are aware of the mid-90 litigations involving playgrounds. So we all got better at it over time. Perfect? Far from it. Are these things explainable, measurable, manageable? Yes. So that's the idea of getting better, is it recording, reporting, analyzing data, and then making decisions based on data rather than on emotion.
Did you have something to add, Rennie?
Actually, Mary can probably do this better than I can because I just asked her the question, but the projections for what they're going to spend over the next 5 years versus what's needed for deferred maintenance and for other capital improvements shows that they're spending roughly, I think, about half as much as if they had full funds that could fund everything. You're talking about $150 to $250 million worth of items that the projected budgets that there's actual funding currently spotted for variation. So you've still got a long way to go in having everything in the city is up to date and well done as people would like. The recovery from the recession and perhaps from not always applying the funds properly is going to be a long road, and it's going to be an expensive one.
I can throw a few more stats out there. So 2018, we have issued a gas tax bond to fund roads and then the GRT bond. We've not issued a GRT bond since 2014. So the plan going forward is to issue a GRT bond every 2 years to the tune of $20 million is what we're forecasting now is what the debt service that the city could absorb and still be financially sustainable.
So at that rate, when do you think we're going to be caught up with maintaining our parks and roads?
So I think it's almost a two-part answer to that, is taking a look at our parks and our roads. I think Richard mentioned we have 72 parks, and the nature of parks in our community has changed over the years. 41% of the GRT bond is actually going to Parks and Rec. So between our the GCCC, Salvador Perez, the Soccer Valley improvements on the south side. So a significant amount is being invested in parks and recreation in the city, but where do we stack? How does that $250 million in deferred maintenance stack up against other cities of our size? How do the 72 parks and the number of recreation centers that we're investing in our community stack up to other communities of our size? And is that what our community wants to be investing our dollars in as well? So I think all of that is part of that question or the answer to your question. So right now we have those figures of we're about $250 million short of sustaining what we need to sustain in our community in terms of investment. And the plan is to start to get on a more regular cycle for those investments. We talked about potentially another parks bond, another geo bond. So there's a lot of demand for the investments, and a lot that has been invested in our community that we have to reasonably be asking ourselves, is this sustainable? Is this sustainable for the population in our community? Is this sustainable for our finances in our community as well?
Hi, I want to say I do appreciate the direction the city continues to move in, but my fear is that the reason there's the perception in the public about that parks bond is because, unfortunately, the previous administration ended up allowing the administration prior to it and the staff to be thrown under the bus around this parks bond. And so this perception that somehow horrible things happened or things didn't happen that should have happened, I've taken issue with from the very, very beginning. And one thing I'd like to say is I understand we like to think that we can, count every penny and make sure it goes in the right place. But the truth is that decisions were made, not only in the city, but in Santa Fe Public Schools during that recession that enabled elected and appointed officials to use the money, not on the parks, but yes, to use city employees to do the things with those parks. I'm not sure it's appropriate to take away the flexibility from elected and appointed officials to do their jobs. I mean, I think that's a very debatable question, and it doesn't get debated very openly and honestly because there are people that like to be critics about whatever's going on in any administration. So I guess what I want to say is I really appreciate, Mary, you guys' movement towards what you're doing, but I appreciate the wisdom of what Richard is saying and the fact that Robert Romero, the city manager, told the city council exactly what was going on with that bond every 2 weeks. So, this wasn't some huge scandal. And also, when the city of Santa Fe, when we look at the quality of life that we have in this community and the shape our parks are in through a recession, I think that shows good management, not bad management. And I think we should just think about how much do we want to tie elected and appointed officials' hands while continuing, of course, to move in the direction of professionalism in these local government entities, which, I'm all for. So there's my speech, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Len.
Sometimes ensuring accessibility to facilities means doing something that affects the general budget, not the bonds budget. For example, the swimming pools, you have to pay lifeguards. How can you increase the amount you pay lifeguards, which has to come out of the general budget? Fort Marcy Pool was closed all summer this year.
Thank you.
Does that deserve an answer?
Go ahead.
It's in the budget process, so we do our job, believe it or not. We build budgets from, let's say we're not going to have any pools. All right, let's say we're going to have one pool. What would that cost? Let's say we're going to have 2 pools. Zero.
Please speak into the microphone, please.
Does that work? Great. So it's referred to as zero-based budgeting, but we do have a starting point. Everyone knows that. So is this a burden to start at zero and build a budget? Not at all. Do things change year to year? Yes, they do. The only constant in the universe. So we look at our budgets, we present our budgets through the process, through the finance department, to the finance committee. There's a little wrangling on it. There's best fit, of the fund, the revenues, tax revenues and GRT. And then the governing body votes on approving our budget, and that's what we call it, an approved budget. Do we have the freedom to move funds within that budget? Limited. If approaches $60,000, as Mary said earlier, then we do take it through committee to council and ask permission, basically, to alter course, to apply funds differently in a means that we deem most efficient after it's most effective. This is a difficult construct. If you're not effective, efficiency doesn't matter at all. So it is a balancing act, equilibrium in the fund and the expenditure.
Specifically, is there some reason that you can't, what do you have to go through in order to increase the pay for a specific class of people, like lifeguards? Is that impossible? Is that something that can be affected through your budget process?
Can someone up there with the microphone just restate the question?
Sorry, what?
What was that?
What was Chris say?
Can you restate the question, please?
Okay, so in general, the question is about so lifeguards at our public pools, and what can we do to increase their pay so then we can avoid closures, as I believe you said Fort Marcy was closed during the summer months. So this is in part a budgeting question and in part a labor question. So we have, I believe the lifeguards are part of the AFSCME union, and so their rates were, the range from minimum to maximum were already predetermined in the negotiations for those labor contracts. So part of the classification and compensation study identified, so classification is essentially we have too many job titles, we need to have the right job titles with the right descriptions. The compensation part of that study was, are we paying our people a competitive rate? And so for certain classifications in the city, and swim lifeguards were one of them, it identified that we are not paying a competitive rate. So they recommended the range from the minimum to the maximum to actually be bumped up. And so the lifeguards now fall outside of below the minimum of the new range. So the proposal to bring all of those classifications up from where they currently are at to the minimum of the new ranges proposed by the consultant would cost the city $1.5 million. So then that gets to your budget question. How will we then afford to pay?
Mary, please get the microphone a little closer to your mouth.
Is this better? So that to bump everyone up from the below the minimum range to the minimum range would cost $1.5 million. So then that is obviously split between different funds, the general fund and the different enterprise funds. So we then have to look at our finances to see if we could support that. For key classifications is the recommendation from the administration, like swim lifeguards, like transit operators, like police. Those classifications that we know we are currently seeing a high turnover because we're essentially a training ground. We train them, we get them certified, and then they leave to another community where they're earning 50 cents more or $1 more. So this is the first step in getting to that point, is having the competitiveness analysis done, and then the second point is identifying the funding for those positions. And where it comes from an enterprise fund like transit is a little bit different than, as you mentioned, the lifeguards, which would be funded out of the general fund.
Thank you. I think we have a question back here.
Ms. McCoy, and if I could just ask all the speakers up there, please speak into the microphones, because I'm having a hard time hearing back here. Getting old really sucks. But I have two questions for you, Ms. McCoy. The first one is, in your presentation, you stated that the person that was doing the journal entries approved the journal entries. And I'm wondering if that doesn't lend itself to the ability to constitute fraud. It seems to me that there should be an independent person approving the journal entries as opposed to the person that was actually making those. The second question I have, and it's because we had a very great presentation yesterday afternoon on sexual harassment. I'm curious, how much has the city of Santa Fe paid out to settle sexual harassment cases in the last couple, 3 years?
Thank you.
No earthly idea.
So on the second question, the answer is quick. I don't know, but I can get back to you. So if you want to get me your contact information after the presentation, if you would like to give me your contact information after the presentation, I can research that and then get back to you. For the second question, the first question on the journal entries is yes, a different person needs to be approving that journal entry than is making it in the system. And so by having a controller in that position, instituting the rules and what needs to be followed and when it needs to be followed and by whom it needs to be followed, we are now assuring that that happens every single time. So again, this was, the controller and I started on the same day. And so I can assure you from that day forward, we have started this new practice. Before then, again, I wasn't here. I am not able to speak to, how it was happening or the level of frequency. We did have different levels in terms of a supervisor and staff as well. So that is something that our internal or our external auditor, CLA, look at every year. And if they deem that to be a significant issue, they will raise it in our audit findings.
Do we have anyone else?
Is that coming from an insurance fund, or is it coming out of, what's the source of the money? Because it seems to me that the city could argue that the sexual harassment that occurred was not part of the person's official duties, and that the city had no knowledge that it was coming about. The thing is, it's all about risk management, and if the employee is a public official, is there an insurance that they take out? I don't think sexual harassment would be covered. I used to work prosecuting physicians, and every time I had a case like that, I would tell the physician's counsel, get this person some risk management information, because they should know that they're subjecting themselves to a personal liability, and that the state or city or whatever is not going to pay. And two, when you settle these things, are they confidential?
Anyone can answer.
I don't have a lot to do with litigation in the city, nor do I have much to do with awarding of jury or negotiated settlements. What I do believe in is running a clean shop. You can recognize a hostile environment within minutes of arriving, and it's our responsibility, due diligence, to remove any obstacles to access, whether it be citizens or employees internally. The other part of sexual harassment, of course, is quid pro quo, and the compensation model is the best way I know of. Recruitment and retention is the best way I know of to ensure that no individual, normally male, I apologize to all of you for being male, but there's no opportunity for them to negotiate some sort of sexual favor in lieu of an earned and appropriate increase in salary due to merit. I would like to applaud our previous city manager, who asked that the governing body devote a sum of monies to recognize employees that go above and beyond, excuse me, through merit increase. Of course, this money was diverted to the comp and class. There are members of my class of managers that wonder why we weren't at the table, having spent my entire career in the management of labor, frontline labor. But be that as it may, we do have these opportunities present themselves. We do have actors in the field making the wrong decisions. We do have a fiscal responsibility to those that are injured, but it's pretty much handled in the legal department, and the risk management part of finance. So I can't really answer where that money comes from or, when we start paying out of our own budgets.
All right, I think that's about our time. I thank you, three of you, very much for your time, your expertise, and the work you're doing at the city. And I certainly appreciate the assurances you've given. So, thank you all.
Okay, we have a scheduled 10-minute break, and we'll be starting our next panel at 10:20. So please come back to your desks and ready to go at that point. See you then. One other thing I want to remind everybody, all lawyers here who are seeking CLE credit, please be sure to complete your CLE forms before you leave today and your evaluations. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time.
It's like she's watching. I know that she talks. Yeah, that's what she thinks. But the point is, what I said is true. What I said is true. And it needs to be said. It needs to be said. It needs to be said. Thank you.
I appreciate the heads up. David Catman.
He took such pride in his potential opportunity, and so it's delightful to yeah, that's our future, that's our youth. And it's all in the presumptive confidence of the teams of the schools.
Those were the original concerns and thoughts.
We're confident that y'all are doing percentage of all city jobs that are far enough along.
Yeah, so we'll have lots of you said 1.5 million percentage of salaries.
I already thought you were probably telling me about
There's multiple different classifications. Like some of our entry level. This job and
Really? This guy's doing a good job? I don't know that. Yeah. I got good money. It's good to see you.
That's not what she says about like the dishes in the house.
How they talk to each other in dialogue, right? And there's this kind of give and take, but also they never quite agree with each other, right? You know what I mean? There's this kind of weirdness going on. Yeah. And you think, wow, what is that?
Strangers should mention it brings the ball.
Yeah.
Well, I was working in San Antonio when Alex Briseno brought forward the idea of a living wage, not a minimum wage. But what does a family of four need to do to escape the poverty level? And so we saw the entry-level salaries rise, which then bumped into the second tier of employees, and then bumped into the supervisory employees, which then bumped into the management employees. And a salary compression is what it is. So there is no difference between being an entry-level lawnmower and a 15-year veteran with supervisory skills. So it's, and we already started seeing it in our salary budget calculations and negotiations, that if we shift too much money to entry level, then that skill set management we were talking about suffers. And getting to the lifeguard situation, this is a skill set, a unique skill set. You know, you have to be able to swim for an hour, and you have to be able to pick up weight off the bottom of the pool and all this stuff. And then there's the idea that you personally are responsible for the life and welfare of others. And this to me is a skill that you're probably born with rather than it's taught. You know what I mean by that? It's an innate ability to care for others, empathy and responsibility and action, quick to action. So how do you reward that? How do you measure it in an interview, and how do you compensate it? I agree. Rob Carter, who came in after me, and John Munoz identified this as number one. And as you may have heard me say earlier, it doesn't matter how efficient you are if you're not effective. So you have to have the doors open, you have to have the services. That's a hard-learned lesson, and one that I've never been able to train bean counter above me. And by the way, Mary barely touched on it, that every 4 years we get to reinvent Santa Fe. You know? And I come from a state where we have strong management, weak council. Every election, there needs to be a continuity of firm. You know what I mean? Like, that's what the difference between a corporation and a sole proprietorship, I'm sure you know, is that there's something that exists after the founder passes on or retires. And so in the city, management of funds, which is what we're really talking about, not management of space or time, but monies, there has to be a thread of continuity from regime to regime, so that we don't have to reinvent our accounting system or our bond justification system every so often. And I believe that national standards are the way to go on that. Just do it like everybody else does. The idea of city different is great if it's smart. It's not great if it's not smart. You know what I mean? But the lifeguards is something we talk about every senior staff meeting. How do we get these kids in the door? The other thing is, it used to be glamorous and lucrative. It's hard to define lucrative in Santa Fe because everybody has a different lifestyle, quality of life. And, so the idea that we need to market it right as a glamorous profession with a lot of responsibility and adequate compensation is the next step in our trial. We are going to try to make it the most glamorous job in the city. Sitting in a lifeguard chair and providing the service. Yeah, you can fool all the people once. That's right.
No, I've lived here since 1989.
Lucky girl. Oh, all right. Well, some of the closures this year were for bond. So they call in sick, and maybe there is something to the fabric of our society that's changing. I know I mentioned Philmont proudly because I was a proud scouter, been a professional scouter, and right. So, thank you for segueing into the the set point for price. Is it better to pay them as little as possible and get more candidates? Or is it better to cultivate a group of professionals and pay them above adequate compensation to keep them here? And this is a constant struggle. And in the union environment, which we barely touched on, as we're taught to barely mention the budget or the union with the public. It's a sacred cow. And this is how they fell out of favor in the 80s, and this is why they're losing their...
Could we please take our seats so we can get started with the next panel? We're about to start panel number 7, so could everybody please take your seats, and people on this panel, please come up here.
Sounds good.
And you can see it up here.
Hi.
Okay.
Joe?
Yes.
Daniel Howell.
Daniel, pleased to meet you.
Nice
sir.
to meet you,
Yes.
too. Please take a seat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Should I wait a little bit because we have four people, or are you gonna be?
No, I'm going to stand. So this one for you.
Okay.
Hi, Alexandra.
What order we sit in?
No, I didn't care at all.
Nice to see you.
Good to see you, too. Okay, we're ready to get started with the next panel. This panel is dealing with the incredibly important issue of housing in Santa Fe. We heard the mayor yesterday talk about the fact that while housing's important, he says that's not the right way to ask the question. His view is we want to create an environment in Santa Fe which attracts and maintains young people, young professionals, so that the city will grow and do better. And while that is certainly the macro goal, those people are not likely to come here unless they have a place to live. And so we think that housing is a crucial issue. And one of the things that we'll hear about in more detail here is are the recommendations of the mayor's task force on affordable housing. That is in your materials. There are also a map, which is a very interesting map that the city has provided us about the demographics of where people live by age and race. That's in your materials. And there's also PowerPoint from the city from January of 2018, which Alexandra may be updating, explaining the various legal handles that the city has to attempt to affect the housing market. I think this is a particularly interesting question because of the challenge of addressing this issue and the fact that anything we do involves the private sector in this. This is not something where we can just provide more housing, public housing. That's an option, but the mix tends to be a public-private mix, and that raises the question of, well, what are the things that we can do that actually will stimulate the private sector to invest in more workforce housing and some housing for homeless people? And why do we think the things that you're going to hear about will actually produce those results? And that's what's crucial here, are the results. If we just tinker around with the private sector, but those incentives or disincentives, however it works, don't generate housing, then we're not accomplishing what we're trying to accomplish here. And one of the things I'm hoping we'll hear from this panel and that you will ask this panel about is, why do they think the steps that they are going to describe will cause a different result than the results, the unsatisfying results so far? I mean, we have a huge housing stock shortage. We need housing for homeless people. And how are the things that you're going to hear about going to really make a difference? On our panel this morning, we have Terry Burnett is here substituting for Mike Lofton from HomeWise. Terry is the business development person there, and you'll be hearing from her not only about what HomeWise can do, but also she played a role with the mayor's task force. Mike Lofton and Carol Luna Anderson, who's also here next to Terry. I'm going from far to closer to me. Carol and Mike were the co-chairs of this mayor's task force, and you'll be hearing from Terry and Carol about that. Carol will also focus on, Carol is the executive director of LifeLink, and you'll be hearing about housing for homeless people in addition to the mayor's task force. Next is Joseph Montoya, the person responsible for housing for the county. And then finally next to me is Alexandra Ladd, who has this position with the city. And so we hope that by covering the mayor's task force report and the various specific foci that Terry and Carol bring, then looking at the county and the city, we'll see what the whole thing looks like, and you'll decide whether it all adds up to more housing or not. So with that, I would like to start with Terry talking about the mayor's task force, the process and the result. And like I said, the task force report is in your materials.
Well, thank you, Daniel, so much. It's an honor to be here. And I just want to make sure everyone can hear me. Is that good? Okay. All right. And I do have some paper copies if you would prefer those. I just made about 5, and also some copies about the top recommendations that I'm going to outline. I encourage you to read it. We tried to really simplify it and make it really straightforward. And so this was presented to the City Council about 3 weeks ago, and we've been steadily working on it since then. But to back up, I want to reference the session before this was about, building trust in government. And I really think that this task force, which was one of 8, really exemplified the mayor's approach to bringing some of the best minds into these issues. And so if you look, and I don't know if you have it on your iPad or whatever in front of you, but that we brought together about 20 individuals from the community, and it represented, we had two foundations, McCune, Santa Fe Community Foundation. We had Los Alamos National Bank, the Santa Fe Association of Realtors, of course, LifeLink, the Chamber of Commerce. So it really was really representative of all aspects of what it's going to take to really change the game on housing.
The task force report is in the written materials as well as on the website. So if you have a notebook, you have it in front of you.
Sure. So this is the main task force. If you, those are 1 of 5. Here you go. But I'll give you one.
Okay, can we get that later? Let's keep going.
Okay. So what this really is, it's a distillation of what we think is going to, like I said, change the game. So I want to just read what we presented to City Council, because as you go through that, you'll see that there's probably about 20 recommendations, and we distilled that down to about 3. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what the mayor has taken from our recommendations and added some of his own, which I think is important for us all to focus on, to keep the city and all parties focused on this issue, and really to make a change, because that's really the point. Recommendations are meaningless unless we see real change. So the first one is city policy. And we focus specifically on promoting the development of accessory dwelling units. We call those ADUs. We talk about them as casitas. And I know that went before the council and died a few years back, but we really want to revisit that. And currently we're working on revisiting the ordinance. And I think the biggest thing to focus on that is we really want to pull it apart from the short-term rental issue, which is a really hot-button issue and has its own ordinance, because what we're focusing on is permanent housing. This is not ADUs for more short-term housing. It's permanent housing. So stand by for that. That's forthcoming quickly. The next is funding and financing, and that's and we recommend dedicating $3 million annually in predictable funding to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So certainly some fee and lieu funds come in through there, and grants and things like that, but not very much of it's predictable, and that's one of our goals. And that can happen, through CIP funds, GRT revenue, property tax revenue, and then hopefully we'll be on the next GRT bond that's going to go through. And we've brought up something that, there's like 2% for arts that often comes out of general funds, and we want to say we should make it 3% for housing. That if we're going to address this issue, that we all need to take on that burden, and not just focus on developers or try to find it through federal taxes or things like that. The last that we focused on was city-owned or controlled property. And that was 2 parts. So we want to ensure that the proposed Midtown campus includes a significant amount of affordable rental and ownership housing. And that's the Chainbreaker Collective is really focusing on that, but that's something that I think everyone's looking to, and certainly our recommendations were to push that affordable housing is included in that. The second aspect of that recommendation was to donate appropriate city-owned land for affordable housing through a transparent RFP process. And that was taken up by the mayor and expanded to include that could include Santa Fe Public School land as well as county land, and that's also in the works. So those are the 3 main recommendations that we brought forth, but I want to add what the mayor has really focused on in addition to those issues. And one of those is to improve the regulation of short-term rentals to ensure that they're not eroding the fabric of Santa Fe neighborhoods. And I think everyone can agree on that. And that's something that we're continuing to work on, and I think there's going to be some changes and focus on that. The other is to support and secure state tax credits to get the Seiler Yard project built. So that's something that's just been kind of hanging on out there. The land is already donated, and it's just a matter of getting the funding to actually build. So that's a focus of the mayor's administration. Also to plan for an integrated mixed-use development for phase 3 of Tierra Contenta. So again, that's affordable housing that's set up to be affordable housing, and it's just stalled out with the downturn, and that's something that's going to be picked up by the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So also to utilize the new opportunity zones as a way to attract more investment in affordable housing. Obviously that's forthcoming, and we're still waiting for a lot of the regulation to come out around that. To hire a project manager and issue an RFP for the next phase, the detailed planning on the Santa Fe University and Art Design project, and include broader community engagement. So we're really pushing that they do hire 2 separate positions, a project manager, but also a community engagement person, and those are 2 different entities. Working down the line, just a couple more. Create a working group to examine the fee in lieu structure, ensure we're maximizing its revenue potential for affordable housing. We just met on that yesterday, so working hard on that. And the last is to have Santa Fe participate in the national Built Zero effort to address and end chronic homelessness in the city. And that's something that it seems that the mayor's really passionate about, and I think could provide, you know, some worthy opportunities for us to really get to zero on homelessness. So I'm going to finish with a quote, and this. So if you were at the city council meeting, you got to see Edgar speak. But I think, you know, we can talk about numbers and we can talk about data and all of these things all day long, but it really comes down to people, right? It comes down to you and I and where we live and the neighborhoods that we value. And I think that is as much a part of the task force journey, and certainly what the mayor really believes in is that we're creating neighborhoods, we're not creating structures. And I think Edgar, who spoke at the city council meeting, really exemplified that. And I just want to read a brief quote that he said. He's a local Santa Fe, and he's 23 years old, and he's part of the Chainbreaker Collective. This is what he said, and he presented this to the city council. He said, "I grew up on West San Francisco Street, the 700 block. It was a safe place for me and my family because of the opportunities that Santa Fe Public Housing offered to me and my mother. But to be honest, I'm still struggling to find a home." And that to us, you know, these recommendations are to meet the needs of the chronic homeless, to the young people that need a place to live that's affordable so that they can live and work here, and to, you know, professionals that are coming in to work at Descartes Labs as an example. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Carol.
Thanks, Terry. Yes, Carol Luna Anderson. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate being here. This is part of the passion that I've been doing for 23 years. And then moving into another phase of my life. But one of the focuses that I would like to really praise the city and those that participated on this task force, this work group, is the fact that it is, everyone sees the issues now, okay? We commented at one of the interviews that I was at that we keep using that term, housing crisis. A crisis is something that happens right now and you do something about it right now. We have a housing reality issue in our community. And so it's the whole spectrum of housing. And that was one of the things that I felt was the great outcome of that work group, is that we addressed housing from those that are living on the streets and homeless, which I'm going to focus on, all the way up to folks who can afford their housing. There just isn't any. And we really wanted to use that term, a spectrum of housing, and we put that out over and over again. So thank you, Terry. I thought that was very good. My focus is going to be on housing for the homeless. It's a real simple solution, and that is if someone doesn't have housing and they want housing, there should be housing available for them. Now, the challenge is there enough? Is there enough stock available? But also, how do we address those individuals and families and youth who do not have any income or have low income that can't afford the rents? So therefore, it brings in another idea, and that is subsidized housing or rental assistance. So my focus is on what are the best practice models that we know around the nation that can address homelessness. The Built for Zero is one, and that is a national movement in which you address those that are the most in need and that have been homeless the longest, and that's the chronically homeless. Also, what you address are the special needs of individuals, whether they're youth, seniors, families, or folks with special needs. And the population that gets the most attention in the newspapers and with a lot of the different types of media are those that would have behavioral health issues. So it's really a very simple approach, and that is we use the term in my world of find, get, and keep. And the find is actually finding the housing. Is it available? Is it affordable? Or is there enough? Is there enough rental assistance available for those that need it? Then helping individuals to get that housing to meet the criteria of getting into the place so that they can live. And then the challenge that many of us who provide these types of services in what we refer to as supportive housing, that is, someone has their housing, but they need supports in order to maintain that. That's the keep part. So we focus a lot for the homeless on supportive housing because the barriers oftentimes are so challenging that it is the support services that actually turn the curve. It actually is what will result in someone being able to maintain that housing and not revert back to homelessness. The challenges that we have seen here in Santa Fe is the fact that we, as a community, have a occupancy rate of around 97%, which means then that it is what I refer to as a renter's market. And if you want to be able to kind of sort through those individuals are potential renters that you would like to not rent to, all you do is raise the rent to the point where they can't afford it or anyone can afford it. And it impacts more than just the homeless. It impacts our youth who are workers, our young families, because the rent should not take up more than 30% of someone's adjusted income. And we see individuals and households coming to our agency for assistance, and they are paying close to 70% of their adjusted income towards paying either their rent or even their mortgage payment and their utilities. Therefore, they are right on the edge of being precariously not able to continue with that. So that is one of the challenges in our community is the lack of the numbers of housing. It is really a relational situation because I believe that if we had an opportunity for those that could afford market rent, for them to have the selection and the choice of where to rent to, it could open up the place that they're renting right now for someone who maybe would not be able to afford the competitive rent, but that they could afford the affordable rent, whatever that term may mean to you. So it does fall. It does, like a domino, it will make a difference. A number of years ago, I've been doing this for, as I mentioned, quite a few years, we had a situation in which all of a sudden we had an excess of rental properties. I know some folks may not remember that, but those of us that are gray do. It was a long time ago, but it gave the opportunity for people to have a choice. And that is that, there is a two-bedroom available over here. There's one in this part of the neighborhood. There's one downtown. And so the individuals or households had a choice. That didn't last very long, maybe not even a year. And then now we don't have that choice because with the subsidies that we provide, our agency has over 170 vouchers that we make available in the community. And a lot of those come with a lot of strings attached, which is sad. But we have a voucher available. We have the family, the household that is seeking housing, and we just don't have a place for them to go. And it's not a question of a choice, it's a question of, is this available, and can we put a deposit on it fast enough to hold it? And that is one of the challenges. Daniel asked me to cover a little bit of the challenges, and I asked some of my staff, and they said, well, you know, we have assistance available. We have a voucher, but there is no place to use that voucher. The other a challenge that I think has been one that is both a challenge and a positive, and that is that there is a real movement within the low-income housing families as well as homelessness, and that is called program housing. And it is where there are particular types of programs or housing entities that are really focusing in on a particular population. Those are becoming very, popular in some areas of the nation. And it doesn't mean that you isolate or that you separate those particular populations. It's just that you provide the appropriate services for wherever they happen to be living. And it is on youth, it is on seniors. We have more seniors now that are losing their long-term housing, or they are losing, they are actually becoming homeless because of the situation. We now have a term that is kind of scary for me, and it's called people are dwelling in cars. And we see that. Drive by Walmart parking lot in the middle of the night, and you will see a number of cars that are kind of clustered together in one corner, and those are homeless people there living in their car for a period of time. So the programming is actually then focusing in on housing, and this is where it gets really exciting, because it is where developers and where realtor programs and architects can come up with some real innovative designs that meet the needs of those particular populations, and also meets what they want. It's what they desire and what they identify. Folks sometimes are kind of surprised when I tell them most of the population I work with do not want to have a single dwelling 3-bedroom house that they got to mow the lawn or water the plants. They really would like to have something different. Folks with behavioral health issues oftentimes feel much safer in a smaller place where everything is real close for them, and they are secure within the environment that they live in. The last is positiveness. I really want to praise our community. I don't want everyone to come away thinking that we haven't done anything. We have actually done a lot in our community. We have more money that has been put towards housing, and not just with homeless housing, but with different aspects. We have focused on building, utilizing tax credits. Over time, sometimes Santa Fe just is not one of the communities that is identified for getting those credits right now, but we do have a number of those. We also have an increase in funding that can help people that are experiencing a short-term need, and that is actually through the Housing Trust Fund that was mentioned earlier. And it doesn't require that someone have a diagnosis, or that they have a particular need. What it is they experience something, and if we could give them rental assistance for 3 months, that would turn the curve for them. And so having that available for situations such as someone was in an accident and it wasn't work-related, and so therefore they lost their income, and it was going to take a while for them to actually recoup, and just getting some rental assistance to help them maintain their housing. Once someone becomes homeless, the cost to the community, if you add everything in that they will utilize during that homelessness phase, is around $40,000 a year. This research has been done in Colorado and in New York, and it is from one of the smaller studies that was done out of UNM in Albuquerque. If we provided rental assistance or provided some housing assistance to the tune of around $17,000, then that makes all the difference. And it doesn't take very, even elementary school kids can see the difference between $17,000 and $40,000. And I think that for my last comment, I'd like to say that as far as I'm concerned, this is as a result of the task force and all of us that are really working towards the housing issue. And that is, for the first time, I think that we have seen the vision, that we recognize that it is a spectrum, that it is a continuum of needs, and that if we solve one little issue in one area, it does impact another area. The population of individuals right now that get a lot of attention on the streets are the homeless. And what we really would like to see is that we address not just those populations so that they, it just breaks my heart every year when we have 11 degrees at night and we have folks that pass away because they don't have a safe place to actually stay. And we would like to see that change. And that's the vision, and I think the passion. For the first time, there are a lot of people that really would like us to see and address the housing issues so that 2 years from now we can go back and add this to all the accomplishments that we have done.
Thank you, Carol. And I just want to add something. I'm on the board of the Santa Fe Interfaith Community Shelter, and we're the primary shelter for the chronically homeless. And we serve something in the neighborhood of 80 to 100 beds a night, people a night, and we serve about 150 meals a night. So some people come to us for food and then they leave, sleep outside, sleep in a car at Walmart, but we're dealing with this population, and if we are not able to take care of them, those people often end up either in the emergency room at St. Vincent's or they end up in jail. They end up somewhere where the costs are even higher. And clearly just providing them shelter is not enough. Housing with supportive services, behavioral health, and other services is what we really ought to be doing. And we will see with this build to zero approach what we can do in Santa Fe to generate the housing for the chronically homeless. So with that, let's move on to see what the county's up to. Joseph.
Sure. Good morning. Hope all is well today. I'm told that I'm going to be able to turn this on and get it going right off. So just as a, maybe I will be able to, a little bit of background. The County of Santa Fe has its Affordable Housing Authority integrated within the county structure itself. So unlike the cities, which has an independent organization, the county's housing authority is a structural part of the county government. Can you read that at all? Is that?
Well, we can turn the lights down.
Thanks. Okay. And so I was fortunate to come back to Santa Fe as there was kind of a, I would say, a resurgence of the need and desire to coordinate affordable housing services and things of that nature. And so one of the first things that both me and Alexandra did when we first came back is we organized a forum between ourselves, the city and the county, and members of what is now called the Santa Fe Housing Action Coalition. And that coalition actually created a formatting, a work plan to increase the amount of rental activity within the county and the city. Right as we had finished that, the elections happened, and then the city of Santa Fe actually, the mayor took a leadership role in trying to, and created a task force, a separate task force. Although some of our recommendations were actually looked at and evaluated within that task force. On the county side, however, we were able to take those recommendations directly to our board, and they full-heartedly endorse those recommendations. So what you're going to see a little bit of now is kind of a more detailed analysis of what is it that we're going on. Just to be clear to you, though, what you're seeing now has not been approved already by the county commission, right? So you're actually seeing it beforehand. However, the tenets of these and the philosophy behind them has already been endorsed by the county commission. Our attorney is in the house, so he's going to be a surprised amount of work he's going to have to be doing here in the future, just so you know. So both the city and county have inclusionary zoning ordinances. We're the only two entities within the state to have inclusionary zoning. The general idea between these next kind of slides is to be able to really look at details of the inclusionary zoning ordinances themselves, make them far more effective, make them far more efficient. One of the largest problems is there is a huge disconnect between the county's general plan, the county's affordable housing plan, the county's regulatory structures, and of course then inclusionary zoning itself. So a lot of this you're going to look at is just simply based on making sure that those systems are well coordinated. To give you an example, and one thing we're actually currently working on now, along with the city, as was mentioned earlier, we just had a meeting yesterday in terms of these programs and policies. The idea of how do you institute inclusionary zoning for rental, right? And what do you have to watch out for, and the kind of activities and the kind of things that you have to be able to do. So we have the ability, if we look at what percentage are viable for rental housing, what can be done economically viably to do it, what can be done legally, right, in order to be able to make sure that there's a rental avenue through inclusionary zoning. And then you have all these little pesky things about processes and getting people, making sure that the people who are saying that they need the rental are in fact people through their incomes and analysis of their incomes and things of that nature. So, and so those are kind of things like a housing authority does every day, all day, right? So coordinating what we're saying is affordable housing, coordinating what those income levels are, coordinating exactly then what level of assistance they're getting, and making that flow very easy is extremely important. So part of what the county is doing currently is making sure not only that those programmatic things are structured to flow within each other, but also administratively. So we're turning things around in terms of how administratively we're structured, so that we can speak with authority about housing and economic development issues, and both from a land use perspective and a finance perspective and a program perspective, to make these things work far more effectively. A lot of the issues here you'll see are the same kind of issues actually that were talked about yesterday, in terms of what are the key issues behind inclusionary zoning, what is it that we really want to achieve, why was it done in the first place, what are the both financial and legal issues that one has to be able to watch out for in terms of making an inclusionary zoning ordinance. Another thing that has been talked about in terms of really, not only is there what is forcing a development to be able to produce, but what is it that the county can do to be able to actually assist in promoting, as was mentioned earlier, the private sector to be able to do a lot more. So the idea is, no matter what, is that the county itself is only going to own and operate. Our goal is to do, once we get going, about 50 units a year that we will own and operate. Right? We currently own and operate 200 units, and we have about 180 vouchers. So internally, we're going to actually increase that asset base in terms of what we own. However, the big money, and actually where only the market can change, is actually assisting the private development in doing what they can. And so your two big issues are land use incentives, of course, and financial incentives. And so creating and increasing our trust fund, we also have a trust fund, and increasing that number, just as the city is looking to do, is important for us to be able to move forward. So we have two different programs currently going internalized within the county. So that's the Happy Roofs program, and also the down payment assistance program. So as you see, one, we want to be able to, our current, for instance, our current both Happy Roofs program and our down payment system programs are mismatched relative to what the regulatory structure is. So we just need to be able to clean that up and get people to be able to use those programs more efficiently and things of that nature. So one of the things, though, is we're looking at the Happy Roofs program is, quite frankly, is to abolish it, right? Because there's no leveraging those funds. There's a lot of federal money available, both in what they call home monies and CDBG funds, to be able to actually leverage full rehabilitation of units. So we actually increase the amount and time, increase the value of what we're providing to the community. The biggest issue right there is the city was just brilliant in its approach in the 90s to be able to actually create, not run programs internally within the city. So when Alexandra speaks all the time, she'll talk about, we have a lot of programs going, but they're contracted out, right? And so during the 90s, the decision was made to be able to say, listen, we don't want these programs to be run internally within the city. What we want to do is actually create organizations or enhance organizations to do the business for us. So the city was actively involved in creating the Community Housing Trust, actively involved in creating the Tierra Contenta Corporation, actively involved in creating the Los Fontanas Corporation, and rebuilding and recreating what was then called Santa Fe Neighborhood Housing Services, as it's now called HomeWise, right? And we've seen a lot of success for that, right? There was a point in time that we had to decide whether we were going to actually just, quite frankly, break neighborhood housing services down, meaning we were the only funder, and the total production of neighborhood housing services was 1 unit of rehab. Instead, we got rid of the whole board. We put in new directorships and new administrative structures, and really, that's been of great value, right? As HomeWise has grown and increased and done incredibly great things, and so that was a great decision. So part of our issue is to take advantage of that, the county's ability to take advantage of those things in order to increase the productivity, increase the amount of funds that we have, and then contract out those services. Same thing goes with down payment assistance. There's no reason in the world why county staff should be analyzing people's financial situations, and our regulatory structure doesn't assist with that anyway in terms of what we're asking for in our underwriting structures. The organizations that are in place now do a far better job than we could ever do, and do it cheaper and better. And so that's the direction that we want to be able to go in. So in order to be able to do these kind of things, what we're going to have to do is create a lot more money in our trust funds. Right now, we're somewhat at the same level that the city is in terms of really we're just recouping from other programs and putting it in there. So we're looking at different avenues for independent sources of funding that is stable and that one can count on, not only for just administrative structures in terms of what contracting out, of course, but for capital stuff in terms of rebuilding. And then a little thing just about county-owned units. This is the housing authority units themselves. We've been extremely effective recently about bringing in other sources of funds, what the county hasn't done traditionally. And so just as an example, we were able to bring in $500,000 of CDBG funds, and we've been able to get new ROS programs, which is to be able to assist for people's individual issues, and an energy program worth about $3 million to actually make our units not only energy efficient, but at net zero energy costs. So part of us are going into new development is the process of counties and cities have a difficult time being a developer just because of the organizational structures and decision-making processes and things of that nature. So actually creating development arms for the county so that, and this is a traditional pattern that's used all around, especially in our case, we'll be actually looking for increased use of federal low-income housing tax credits. We recently just bought a purchase of land, and we're doing the pro forma now, and we'll be looking at not applying for tax credits this year, but next year. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. And now we'll hear from the city, from Alexandra Ladd, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thanks, Dan. All right, you guys, hard acts to follow here. All I can drone on and on about is like boring bureaucratic stuff. But I actually think that this is a great segue into what the city of Santa Fe does and has been doing for a long, long time, because I did want to pick up on what Carol said about it's election season and everyone's talking about, oh, there's an affordable housing crisis. And those of us who have been doing this work for a long time are looking at each other like, what are you talking about? This has been happening for decades. People have been outpriced because of capital coming from other communities, and they've been displaced, and they've been leaving our community for decades. And all of a sudden, it's a crisis. So with that said, in the 90s, as Joseph alluded to, and he was being very modest because he was actually one of the primary architects of this way of supporting affordable housing, which is that the city looked around and said, you know, we're not all that good at providing services directly. We got too much sort of red tape around everything we do. We really don't want to manage housing units because we have a housing authority that's completely separate from the city government. So I'm just going to say that again, completely separate, because people mix us up all the time. And it is confusing because at the county, it is part of the county government. So I understand the confusion. But we didn't want to manage housing units. We didn't want to build them. And so we outsourced everything. But I would call it really more of convening partnerships. And through the convening of those partnerships, the city was able to procure the services that were relevant to the community. So instead of saying, we're going to do this, we said to the service providers, what do you hear from your clients, from your constituents? What needs to happen in the community? Oh, you need a rental assistance program. Let's do that. So in a way, the city has managed or sort of crowdsourced the way we support affordable housing in the community. As Carol talked about, federal funding is great, essential, helps us leverage other resources. You know, we really couldn't do without it, for sure. However, it is like wrestling a bear. When you look at the regulation and the reporting burden and the sort of nonsensical restrictions that come along with it. And so Carol can struggle with a federally funded voucher because her homeless person who's in front of her, who has been living on the streets, does not qualify because for 3 nights that person stayed in a motel. And suddenly the clock resets and they have to be documented for another year of not having a stable place to live. That's crazy. So with our local money, Carol can give it to the people she knows who are precariously housed, and that covers the gambit from everyone who may be more of a chronically homeless person all the way up to the working person who just has hit tough times for whatever reason and needs a little help to get back on their feet. So I do want to emphasize that our local money, the city's local money, is extremely powerful and very well leveraged. It is also, the use of it's also controlled by state law. So building on our prior presentation, where there might not be total trust in how the city spends money, we actually have to follow state law in terms of the eligibility of the projects and the reporting of how the funds are used. So it can't be used for services, it can't be used to pay salaries, it can only be used to provide direct financial assistance to an individual, which the city doesn't do. We do it through our nonprofit partners, HomeWise, the Housing Trust, LifeLink, St. Elizabeth's, and there are many more. And I do also want to underscore that point. The capacity of the nonprofits in this community is absolutely out of this world and not matched in any other part of our state. But with that said, now I just lost my train of thought. Oh dear. Well, back to the convening role that the city plays. When city funding is allocated to the nonprofit partners, it accomplishes a couple different things. And over the years, and this is where Joseph was so instrumental in understanding, hey, if we build up the capacity of the nonprofit partners, that's where we get the most bang for our buck. And they can raise money to build a new wing or to establish a new program or to serve a new population because the funders and the foundations, they love that. They can put their name on something. It's really hard to get funding to pay the rent. It's really hard to get funding to pay someone's salary. That is not glamorous. That's not what a funder wants to do. But it's a really great role for city money, for local money, because we can say to Carol's organization, we're going to cover some of your administrative costs. And in turn, you're going to provide a report. You're going to tell us all of the people you've been serving. You're going to describe your outcomes. You're going to give us data that shows why what you're doing, the programs you're running, the housing you're supporting or building, why that's making a difference in the lives of people. So I did, and again, Joseph was being modest, but that was really his brainchild. And I think for years and years and years, we've had amazing success, and you would never have known it if you had heard all of our candidates talking about this housing crisis. It just came out of nowhere. But we do have an incredible network in our community for addressing this issue, and we've been hugely effective in the past, and everyone has talked about all of the new energy and the new public awareness, and I think that is really different, is that people understand that we can't just say we're going to build single-family homes for firefighters and then everything's going to be okay. No, we have to provide support and improvement and expansion for everyone within the whole spectrum of housing needs. So that means that the needs of a homeless person are related to the needs of a low-income renter, which are related to the needs of a higher-income renter who may want to buy a house, which are related to the needs of a homeowner who might need help with a home repair. And then we have the person on the other end who maybe doesn't want to live in a single-family home anymore because they're elderly and they don't want to care for it. They want an affordable apartment again. So, you know, it's kind of the ecosystem concept, or your chain is only as strong as the weakest link kind of idea. And I think we finally, and the task force did a great job of really setting this out, we have to look at the framework of providing the services, particularly as it relates to the whole spectrum of housing need. So I really want to call that out as a big move forward. I think next year at this conference, I will be able to present all sorts of exciting amendments to our inclusionary zoning program. Right now, what you have in your packet is pretty much, Joseph also touched on how inclusionary zoning works, is what we do. We've been very, very successful on the single-family home ownership side. It works well. It works not at all well on the rental side. The city has put a lot of support into 100% affordable apartment projects, Stagecoach Apartments, Village Stage Apartments. Solaris Station is currently underway, has broken ground and is being constructed. And what's really great about those apartments, to get back to what Carol said, was that they can also provide the support services for those renters on site, or they can coordinate those services, they can connect people to services, because when you're a very low income renter, the cost of your housing is a huge part of your challenge, but it's almost never the only challenge you have. So if you can live somewhere where there are people also checking in, hey, do you need a ride to your doctor's appointment? Oh, you know, our caseworker's coming to the site tomorrow. Do you want to talk about getting your kids some extra help at school? Do you need to take an ESL class? How about a GED class? Oh, and then for people who are doing really well, how about some homebuyer training, financial fitness? So, you know, it's important, because I think that's part of the message that gets lost when people look at inclusionary zoning on the rental side and they say, oh, but that's the whole point of this is to disperse these lower priced rent restricted units throughout our community. And that is important, but really at this point we're realizing that the success of people being assisted through rent restrictions is the services they get along with that rent restriction. And it's really hard to administer those services in a scattered site kind of way. And I have to say one quick thing. The city has been in the process of trying to donate a parcel of the Silo Road complex to the Arts and Creativity Center. Terry said that it's been donated. It hasn't been donated yet. And I just need to point that out, because it won't get donated unless all of the other subsidy financing is secured. And in that situation, it will provide for about a $2 million value, which includes other fee waivers and other a little bit of cash, we'll leverage a $15 million-ish project, which is, if you were a private industry, that's a really great investment. So, we're trying to really emphasize, because we hear a lot of like, oh, giveaway, you're just giving things away, city. We're not. We're really strategic about this. So I'm happy to answer any questions offline from anyone who has concerns about that, because I do hear that. I hear it from city employees too, which is interesting to me. But and I think the other point I wanted to underscore, Joseph talked about this a little bit, was that the regulation, the requirement for the development community to provide affordably priced units has to go hand in hand with incentives. Like, we have to have a carrot that goes along with a stick. And we have incentives written into our code. Yesterday we spent a bunch of time talking about, could we expand these incentives? And they don't necessarily have to have a cash value, but what if it just took less time to get through your development approval, so you didn't have that carrying cost of holding onto your land or your project while you jump through a million hoops? What if there's an incentive that's graduated? If you provide more above the required amount of affordable housing, you get a density bonus that's bigger, or you get a bigger fee waiver or something. So we will be working on all of that within the next few months to try to actually reward the private sector for providing moderately and affordably priced housing, because we know there are a lot of people in this community who would probably step up to the challenge. And our previous inclusionary zoning program did have a classification for a moderately priced market rate project. Didn't have to comply with the affordable housing inclusionary zoning requirement, because what they were providing was meeting part of the spectrum of need. And maybe it was not the most affordable renter, but it was someone who was more of a moderate income person. But that's still back to this whole idea that everyone's need affects everyone else's. If we can create that inventory and get people stably housed and affordably housed, then the entire network is much stronger for it. I think that's all I have to say.
Very good.
Thanks, Alexandra. What we know about the current housing situation is that there are somewhere between 100 and 200 chronically homeless people in the city. And we also know that the city and the county have done some investigations into how many units do we need so that we could actually provide workforce housing to the people who work in this community. And I think the shortage is what, 2,000 units? At least 2,000 units. And so my question for all of you is this. So we've got 100 to 200 units we need for the chronically homeless. We've got, let's say, 3,000 more units we need to really begin to cover the people who are working but need affordable housing, the people who just want to stay in this community and be part of our workforce. So how does this array that we've heard about of strategies generate that number of units in a reasonable amount of time? And I don't know whether the policymakers and the people carrying out the policies at the city and county government and at HomeWise are looking at that question and saying, okay, let's get really specific. We've got this array of strategies. You heard about it from the mayor. You heard more about it today. How many units do we think each of these strategies is going to generate over the next 2 years? And does that take care of the need? And if not, well, where else do we have to turn to do this? And so let me start by asking Terry this, whether, as far as you can tell from HomeWise's perspective, are people targeting those goals specifically in terms of these different programs? And if not, how are we going to ever know whether we're getting there?
Well, I think it's a really critical question, and I can speak on behalf of Mike and HomeWise, and what I heard from him throughout the task force and in general in the work and the way he approaches the work is that, we can constantly look at these numbers as these lofty goals, or we can just get the work done. And I think that that's been HomeWise's approach. And how you scale that up, I think, is making it friendlier for private entities to develop. And I think that that's been a huge focus of the recommendations of the task force, is to how do we make it easier and friendlier, and that we get the needs met. So that, to us, is affordable housing across the spectrum.
Yeah, I just also wanted to respond that I have a sort of innate discomfort with putting a unit number, because that implies that there's a finish line. Oh my God, if only we can get to 2,400 units, we're done. We're never going to be done with this. Like, this is going to be an integral part of our government operations, our nonprofit services, funding forever. So we have to kind of think of it more as a chronic challenge. Like, we are always going to be doing this. But then the other thing I wanted to say too is that new units, affordability doesn't necessarily have to come from new construction. If Carol gives somebody rental assistance for 3 months, she has just made their unit affordable to them. That is the creation of an affordable unit. If we help somebody even with a refinancing, that can make a unit affordable, or home efficiency improvement. Suddenly their energy costs are lower. That makes it affordable. So I do want to emphasize that we're not just focused on, we've got to throw up a bunch of new housing units and then we've solved our problem. This is drops in the bucket, but every drop counts, and each drop is going to be a little bit different, according to the need of that person, that family, that household.
So I also think it's a really good question, and so to try to put some numbers, there's actually studies that show that we need 6,000 units. Our study group that we had done before said that we're needed 5,000 units, so that's our only rental. That's for only rental for people under 100% of median income. To translate that into dollars and cents, we're talking over $1 billion in order to be able to create that, 350 acres of land. So, I mean, you have to, if you're going to create a new unit, you need to put it in some place, and if you're going to put it in some place, you need to finance it. So it's a huge thing, not undoable, right? It's not undoable. In the past, the city of Santa Fe has made very specific target markets for very specific things, and it's happened. But that's the scale of it, right? Now, I think it was mentioned, and I agree, just doing that alone is not the issue, right? There's also complexities, and I think it's very important. Housing is a part of our society, right? So it's not dumping all the units in one place, right? Making sure that there's, as Santa Fe has historically been an integrated place in terms of incomes and typologies of architecture. So it's incredibly important that we're very judicious about how we create those units. But I don't want to get away from the thought that we should have a goal of number of units, quite frankly, and what it's going to take to be able to reach that goal. And so the programs that you heard about today aren't going to do it. So there's going to have to be a lot more. There's going to have to be fundamental changes in the city and county's land use regulations to be able to actually create the necessary densities to be able to allow for affordability. There's going to have to be fundamental differences in terms of the amount of money, the amount of capital. When it's been mentioned here about federal low-income housing tax credits, right? Right now, it's a point system to be able to get those tax credits, and Santa Fe is at a disadvantage, right? One of the few ways that we can put ourselves and make us more competitive is to be able to actually leverage more money. That means more money coming to be able to leverage the literally billions of dollars of equity capital that can come to an apartment complex.
One of the things that was really interesting that we were able to share at the task force meeting is something that a lot of folks just don't realize, and that is, along with the housing vouchers that I mentioned, we have to do a housing quality standards, an HQS. Okay, and so we would go and someone would be willing to rent their apartment or their house or a single dwelling and utilize our voucher. However, the structure itself didn't pass the HQS, and so we were stuck. And sometimes it was just simple little things that needed to be done, but it was something that as an agency we weren't able to do. And we brought this up at the meeting that's one area that if we could have helped this homeowner, this landlord, increase or address the issue of their particular dwelling, then they would have been able to pass that HQS, and that would have given us another unit. And it was wonderful to hear, because what came about is the builders, we had the realtors were there. I think the Civic Housing Authority participated, and there were even a couple of the banks. And one of them said, well, why can't we just set up a fund in which it would be, low interest. It would be something that they could repair, whatever it was. We weren't talking a lot of money. We're talking a couple of thousand. In some cases, it's just the GFIs that needed to be in the bathroom. And those can be done for a few $100s. And they said, if we could coordinate that, that you tell us, we talk with the homeowner, we create this assistance, and in some cases, some of them said, we have maintenance folks, we could actually do some of this. So I have to meet all of the regulations, of course, but just that conversation alone gave potential of because rental income is one of the things that we have noticed that many of homeowners in our community utilize in their senior years as their way of sustaining. And if they, and it's important that they be able to do that so that they then don't become homeless, okay? What we also brought up is that, okay, if we're gonna look at all these ADUs, that is a potential. Is there a way that we can, with the regulations, make it a little bit easier? Of course, I don't know all the regulations, so y'all can figure all that out. But if it was an incentive, if we could incentivize them and say, hey, then would you make this unit affordable for 5 years for someone who would qualify in the community, not necessarily the homeless, but that would qualify. Again, there is increasing the stock, and it's a win-win on both ends.
Thank you, Carol. Are there questions?
So yesterday there was a presentation by the Coalition of Sustainable Communities about this new community solar bill that we're working on getting it addressed at the legislative session. And one of the inputs we've gotten from a number of groups is they want to make it accessible by both low-income customers and also affordable housing customers. The definition we've been working with is for low-income customer comes out of a existing regulation at the Public Regulation Commission. It's an annual household income at or below 200% of the federal property level as published by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. My question is, in order to make this accessible by not low income and moderate income people, is there some kind of existing definition of affordable housing, any statute, or that we could plug into this legislation that would help with that?
The closest thing that there is under, I'm sorry, is that okay? Can you hear me? The closest thing that there is under the Affordable Housing Act, so that, as you may know, there's this constitutional clause that's called the Anti-Donation Clause. And the Anti-Donation Clause is very clear in terms of not being able for a city or a county or any subset of the state being able to donate lands, property, infrastructure, anything of that nature without the use of an Affordable Housing Act. And so there's two issues. There's the Economic Development Act and the Affordable Housing Act, slightly patterned about each other. In order for a person, a nonprofit, a for-profit, and there's very clear guidelines about who and under what circumstances a city or county can provide services to that, you have to define what affordable housing is. The Act says itself that it allows the city or the county to be able to define that, right? And so in order to define that, though, they have to be able to do studies to indicate what the needs are. The idea is that you can't subsidize somebody that doesn't need it, right? If it wasn't for this use of funds, it would not happen. Generally within the state, that's defined as household income, HUD guidelines for household income. Generally, in some parts of the states, they kept it to 80% of median income. I think Santa Fe is 100%, 120. So is the county. I haven't found any statistics right now actually within the affordable housing plan, the first affordable housing plan that was produced as part of that, to actually show that what kind of level of subsidy is needed to support people at 120% income. So yes, there is definitions, it's statutory definitions, but those definitions are created by the individual, either the municipality or the county.
Thank you. Another question.
Hello. First, a comment. Just like to say we're all fortunate to live in a town where we have such able and committed people working on this, and I'm grateful for the service all of you have done. I'm glad to see the focus on housing. I've been outed as a government employee, so I'll have to preface my question by saying this doesn't reflect the viewpoint of any elected officials or my employers. But I have to ask, looking at your report, I did not see any reference to a luxury home transfer tax. I remember when there was a proposal, has it been 10 years ago? It was pilloried by certain private sector interests, but I know that some cities have imposed that recently, and could that not be a good source of funding for housing trust funds, particularly given the dynamic that we're all aware of in Santa Fe of very wealthy people moving here to buy their home or one of several homes?
I'll take a stab at it. So I think that the transfer tax, certainly property taxes, are all something that we're looking at. Wanting to look at impact fees, short-term rental fees. It's something that we're just trying to get some more data on. And then, of course, just the political viability of it. And I think our primary goal in this, as much as it's the right thing to do, it's also we have to really follow the political viability. And we're just trying to get some early wins. And I think that was the goal of the mayor and the task force. And so get some traction and then start to dig into some of those deeper long-term issues. But I think Joe's got some really good answers about some of the state tax law that really keeps us from doing some of these things. Your turn.
So I wasn't here for what happened within the city of Santa Fe for its transfer tax, so I don't want to be able to speak to that. As you all know,
Joe, can you speak a little?
As you all know very well, right? There's kind of statutory issues in terms of what the authority is of different with a county municipality to be able to institute taxes. Transfer taxes, as they're generally called throughout the nation, are considered the most widely used source of funding to create affordable housing. There are a lot of both institutions and cities different wide that have used other kind of nexus issues besides the transfer tax. San Francisco has actually taxed high-end jobs in order to be able to provide funds. There's a lot of different mechanisms. There are some, structural regulatory issues within the state, statutory issues that one has to watch. The second biggest source of funds to be used for affordable housing is an increase in fees, and generally speaking, those fees are like recording fees. So the county of Santa Fe is a recording fee. In talking to somebody just recently, of course, there is some statutory authority of the limitations of using a fee structure, because you can only charge as much as the organization itself needs to be able to support itself fees. Otherwise, it becomes a tax, and so that one person is actually the person that actually. Asked the question just recently. So
are we looking at a change? Are we looking at a change? Are we looking at getting whatever state authority we need so Santa Fe can raise the money necessary to support more housing in this city? Are we doing that?
Yes.
If not, why not?
Yes. Short answer, yes. And I do want to pick up on that because, Rick, I think you bring up a really good thing. It was a little bit, the transfer tax after the debacle 10 years ago it's a little bit like kryptonite. Nobody wants to touch it because it was so divisive and kind of brought out the worst in everybody on all sides. But we are in a different environment. The recession hadn't happened then. I think we're all looking at housing a little bit differently. And what's very appealing about the idea of the high-end luxury home paying something to support affordable housing is that there's such a clear connection in most people. It really resonates with most people, that connection between this high-end home is increasing values, is decreasing affordability, not to mention that person living in that high-end home is demanding more in the services that are filled by low-wage service workers. So the connection is very tangible. And I do, I think just because it was a hot button issue before doesn't mean that we aren't, and we have started the process of putting some more research into it to figure out, is it just a PR issue, or do we have some serious statutory things we have to change?
All right. Any other questions? Yes, there's one more, and then we will need to conclude this panel.
Hi, thank you. I don't think it was a hot button issue. I think it was a terribly run campaign, and that's why we lost. We didn't do the work beforehand on the ground, because I think that the people in Santa Fe want this, and nobody who's buying $1 million home is going to care if it costs $2,000 or $3,000 more. It's just not a reality for those people. So I think this is a fantastic way to get a lot of money really quick and to invest back into the city of Santa Fe. And a lot of those people, they're here for like 3 weeks a year. I mean, there are a lot of empty homes. And so this is like a perfect thing, a way to get money really pretty easily. So I'd be happy to work on such a campaign.
And on behalf of the committee, or our work group, we did bring this up. I mean, we talked a whole lot about different taxes. We talked a lot about short-term rentals. We talked about the ADUs. There were all kinds of things that we, that came, and some spoke in favor of the neighborhood associations, wanted to make sure that they got included. And so it wasn't that we just ignored it. In the doing of the report, though, what we really wanted to focus on is, okay, we needed to have some good outcomes, and we want everybody in the community to be behind some aspect of what we were doing. So, yes, there were lots of comments, just as you said.
Okay, it's time to wrap up this panel. Thank you very much for your presentation today.
Real estate people really.
So our speaker is Justice Charles Daniels. I'm not sure he's here yet, but he knows to be here, so I'm sure he'll be here in just a moment. So if you can just hang out, and then lunch is at 12:30. But we're going to get going with Justice Daniels as soon as he gets here, so please stay close. Thanks. Okay, could people take your seats, please, so we can continue with our program? Everybody in, please take your seat. Justice Daniels, good to see you. Good to see you. Would you like to stand? Would you like to sit? Where would you like to be?
Better think you standing up. I don't know if Kyle will.
That's fine. So why don't you come here if you would?
What time do you want me to start?
Now.
Oh, yeah?
At 11:30.
I'm late then, huh?
Okay. So our next speaker is Justice Charles Daniels. Justice Daniels has been on the court for a little over 11 years. And I'm sorry to say, I'm sure he's happy to hear, but I'm sorry to say that he's going to be retiring in a few days. We will miss him greatly. And in your materials is a biography of Justice Daniels, and I will not take any time now to repeat all of that. He is an outstanding jurist in this country, and particularly for the state of New Mexico. And without further ado, I present to you Justice Charles Daniels.
And thank you all for having me again. Can you hear me in the back of the room? All right. My voice is not as strong as it used to be, along with various other parts of my body. It's time to be going out to pasture, but I've really enjoyed the 11 years that I've served on the Supreme Court. And when Dan called me to join you here today, we decided that I would talk to you about some reflections on this 11 years that I've spent, some reflections on justice, some reflections on being a Supreme Court justice. And despite the kind words in his introduction, none of us is indispensable. We'll be replaced. There'll be other good people to carry on the work of the court, which is much more important than any one individual who has the opportunity to serve the way I did. It's all about the job. It's not about us personally. And that's one of the things that I wanted to share with you today about the importance of remembering that it's not about us. This job carries with it a lot of trappings of respect, but true personal respect has to be earned. It can't be obtained by demand. It can't be obtained by a job assignment. It truly has to be earned. There is a respect that goes with a job, but it's for the institution itself. It's not for those of us who've been blessed with the opportunity to take on the responsibilities of a position like that. As Justice Bosson said to me once during a case conference, as we were philosophizing together, he said, you know, there are a lot of good people who could do this job that we have. We're not the only ones who could do this. A lot of other people could do it as well, maybe even better. But we happen to be the ones that have the responsibility to carry it out now. And we have to live up to that responsibility. And he's right about that. I can think of loads of people who could do a great job on the Supreme Court, and I'm encouraged to see that there are a number of people who are applying to replace me and to replace Justice Maes, who's leaving the same millisecond that I am. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice for some reason. I guess, yeah, I'll take that. Thanks, Dan. I don't know if it helped. It seemed to help a little bit there. And the job is not a personality transplant, or at least it shouldn't be. There have been a few people over the course of the history of our court who've taken the position that putting on the robe somehow transformed them into a different kind of being, deserving of some kind of bowing and scraping, but they fail to realize the bowing and scraping goes with the position, not with the individual. In fact, right after I got appointed to the court and before I swore in and put that robe on, I was going to some kind of a reception. I can't remember what the occasion was. It was an unrelated reception at the Albuquerque Country Club for the Albuquerque Bar Association. And as I was walking up the sidewalk, there was a federal judge that I'd known for a long time, since we were child lawyers trying cases against each other decades before, who saw me and said, "Well, congratulations on being named to the Supreme Court, but I guess you'll have to change some of the things you do as a result of the job." I think he was talking about my golf substitutes. I'm not a golfer. There's nothing immoral about it. I don't want to pass judgment on anybody who hits the ball around the greens on the weekends. It's a fine thing to do, but I have different forms of recreation that are a little bit more unusual for a lawyer and for a judge. And before I could answer him, I knew what he was talking about. Justice Franchini, retired Justice Franchini, walks up and he butts into the conversation. He was never shy about that. And he said, "If you have to change who you are for a job, you don't want that damn job." And I said, "I'm with him." And so I've continued to carry on my golf substitutes, but never to lose sight of the fact that my primary responsibility is with the judicial duties that constituted more than the full-time job. And there was another bit of advice I got from Justice Franchini that I thought was so important that I hung it behind my desk, and to prove it, I brought it along with me. What do I do with that? Unfortunately, in New Mexico, judges have to go through partisan political elections in order to stay on the bench after their initial merit selection appointment. It was the result of a political compromise back in the 1980s between the political forces and the reformer forces on judicial selection and retention. And so we're constantly aware that the decisions we make could result in our loss of our jobs, because sometimes the public doesn't understand the roles of judges, that we're not the ones in a democratic society who are given the responsibility of creating law and policy. We're there to make sure it's carried out according to the dictates of the branches of government that are the true political forces and the lawmaking representatives of the people. And often the public doesn't know all the factors that go into making a judicial decision, the evidence that we've seen, the legal principles we've been bound by, the constitutional limitations on our powers, and so on. And so there's always an awareness that what you do can affect your ability to keep your job. Fortunately, my experience has been that most judges at all levels of the courts, particularly in this state, including the Supreme Court, think it's much more important to do the job right than to keep it. I went to Justice Franchini's memorial service when he passed away a few years ago, and I was so struck by his expression of that thought that was on the memorial program that I took the cover of it, which had his photo, and framed it along with the quotation that they had on his memorial service. It says, "If getting a job and keeping the job becomes more important than doing the job, then the job is not worth having." And I keep that behind my desk and look at it every day before I turn around and sit in the chair and do my work. I may spare you from a long talk here because I don't know if my voice is going to last. I hope this is not permanent. Let me share some thoughts with you about working on a multi-member court. it's a lot different than the job of a trial judge, who's essentially a lone wolf making decisions without participation or without having to work together with other judges. It's important for us to realize that we're not just 5 separate human beings, each casting our own votes. We're part of an organic whole that has to issue decisions in the name of the institution, in the name of the Supreme Court. We are the precedent-setting court in New Mexico and have been for the entire time we've been a state. But more importantly, we focused on it in the more than 50 years since the creation of the Court of Appeals. Because when the Court of Appeals was created in the 1960s, it took on one of our previous functions, which had been an error-correcting court. In New Mexico, all parties have a right to one appeal, to review a judge's decision, to make sure there's a backstop behind every decision. There's a second opinion. And until the 1960s, the Supreme Court had performed that function as well as being an error-correcting court. But when the Court of Appeals was created, and as jurisdiction was gradually given to it, the functions were split up. The Court of Appeals became the primary error-correcting court to review the decisions of the lower court judge and decide whether those had been rendered in accordance with the law as set out in the constitutions and the statutes and the precedents set by the New Mexico and U.S. Supreme Courts. And the New Mexico Supreme Court took a step back to focus on being a precedent-setting court and not to be just another layer of error correcting. Because no matter how many layers you create of error correcting, someone has to be the last voice anyway. It might as well be, in most cases, the Court of Appeals. They're all law school graduates, experienced lawyers before they became judges. They're bright people. They're as capable of making those decisions as we are. But the Supreme Court has the exclusive responsibility to establish precedent, interpreting our state constitution. We're the final voice on that. Even the U.S. Supreme Court can't overturn a decision of ours, no matter how foolish it may seem. Hopefully we don't do that, but in theory they can't overturn a decision of ours on interpretation of a clause of the state constitution. We're the final voice in that, just like the U.S. Supreme Court is the final voice on federal constitutional review. We're the final voice in interpretation of state statutes. We're the final voice on the creation and amendment of state common law, where there are gaps between statutory provisions, always recognizing that it's the right of the people through their elected lawmakers to change the common law where they see fit, or change our interpretation of a statute. And so our review of the Court of Appeals decisions is not just to say whether we would have decided it in exactly the same way. I hate to use the phrase, but if it's close enough for government work, we leave a Court of Appeals decision alone. If it's an issue of whether there was substantial evidence or whether the judge abused discretion on a particular issue, we think that one layer of second opinion is enough to deal with those kinds of things. It's only the cases where there's a need for the Supreme Court to settle an unsettled area of law, where different panels of the Court of Appeals may have different views. Often where a three-judge panel is split on an issue, and it's a serious issue that has precedential importance. Where we think they've just completely gotten the ship headed in the wrong direction and are either not following our precedents or are just headed off in the wrong direction. In those cases, we grant certiorari, sometimes ultimately end up agreeing with the Court of Appeals, often disagreeing, which is one of the reasons we may have granted cert in the first place to decide to review it. And the result is that we leave 90% of the decisions alone without granting another layer of review of the Court of Appeals decision. Our major priority is to get the issue settled so people know what they can depend on, what they can plan on, how they can plan their conduct, how they can plan their businesses, their family relationships, and so on. In fact, I think it's so much more important to get those things settled than it is to have an individual justice's view prevail over his or her fellow justices. That in my 11 years of the court, I've never written a dissent. There have been a lot of cases where I might have, if the majority opinion hadn't been altered in a way that I thought I could live with. Because after all, the majority opinion is the law. It's the pronouncement of the Supreme Court. The dissent can only perform a couple of functions. One if it's a really important issue that we're disagreeing about, where a justice thinks that terrible consequences are going to come from the court's opinion, or to alert the people to have their lawmaking representatives take it on, then there may be a reason for dissent. But in all the cases I've been involved in on the court, we never reached that point by the time we got to the final form of the opinion, which may have been modified a number of times. Sometimes you can persuade your fellow justices to come around to your view. If you work with them in a collegial way, sometimes you should re-examine your own views and decide how best to find that principled common ground. The only time you'll find my name on a dissent in the opinions I've been on have been a couple of times where the court was irreconcilably split. There was a majority and a dissent anyway. And in those couple of cases, I picked the view that I thought best when I ended up joining the dissent. In the other cases, you'll find me on the majority opinion, and I'm glad to say in the authorship a large number of times. I think sometimes we let our disagreements become ego battles, and a dissent serves no more good for the stability of the law, and instead is an expression of, well, I think I'm smarter than the rest of these people. I would have decided this case this way. It doesn't do anything for the stability of the law or the future of the law. A lot of times there are two reasonable approaches to reading a statute, to deciding an issue of common law. And we have to pick among them, and whatever the majority of the Supreme Court says becomes the law. Luckily, I've served on the court during a period of great collegiality. There have been times in the past, decades ago, when our Supreme Court was not a collegial body. During my lifetime in the law, I'll hit my 50-year mark in a few months as a lawyer. And there have been times when we had a dysfunctional group of people on the Supreme Court who couldn't get along with each other, couldn't talk to each other, certainly couldn't work together on finding principled common ground. But for the 11 years that I've been on the court, through a number of changes, times when I've worked with justices who came onto the court with different party affiliations, 3 Republicans, I think 5 Democrats. It's always been collegial. We've always listened to each other, we've worked together, and there's not been one who wouldn't change their views when it was called for. Some have been tougher than others, but all of them were collegial, and all of them tried to decide the case without regard to the politics that may have led them there. In a sense, there's no way to get politics completely out of the system, because we have gubernatorial appointments, just like in the federal courts they have presidential appointments, and it should be no surprise to anybody that appointing authorities usually appoint people with similar views rather than people with opposing views. They appoint their friends rather than their enemies. That's human nature. There's no way you're going to get that out of the system. Luckily, in New Mexico now we have the merit selection screening, so that the governor at least is limited to people that the nonpartisan commission has found would be suited to serve on the court, so that whatever politics may go into the initial appointment, they won't result in the elevation of someone unqualified to serve, as was the case when I became a lawyer and it was a pure political system. We had a great variety of judges and justices, some of them great, but some of them notably less than great. These days, we're much better at removing the bottom feeders from the list of potential appointees. But regardless of how the people came to the court, regardless of what their stated party affiliation was when they came onto the court, and regardless of whether they ultimately changed their party registrations, like a couple of us have during my time on the court, to change our registration to reflect our philosophies. For the last 9 years after I got through my required political election after appointment, I changed my registration to independent, as did another of the justices, to reflect to the public what I saw as my role on the court. I don't think there's a Democratic justice or a Republican justice in the sense of Republican laws or Democratic laws. We're there to enforce the laws, period. And the court should be the non-political branch of government. Politics has a place in the lawmaking branches of government, and that's where it ought to do its work. But there ought to be one branch of government you can go to enforce the law without regard to your political party or without regard to which political party would like a particular outcome, because otherwise our law is not a system of laws. It's just another political branch, and I think it would not only be bad in function, it would be bad in what is the most important underpinning of the judiciary, which is the public confidence that when they walk into a courthouse, they're going to get a fair shake. And the color of their skin won't make a difference. Their political party, their personal philosophy won't make a difference in the kind of justice they get from our courts of law. I think it's very important to keep that in mind as we're deciding our cases. And I'm glad to say that my experience with all of my colleagues has been that no governor has been pulling puppet strings on us or calling in decisions to make or even interfering with our decision making. There have been some grousing comments after we made a decision. I'm sure you've read some of those in the newspaper that we try to ignore because politicians do get political, but they've never affected our resolution of the cases. We had a couple of hotly contested fights between the Democratic legislature and the Republican governor in the last couple of years. The political forces were lined up on opposite sides. They brought two cases. The legislature brought two sets of cases to us to try to overturn gubernatorial vetoes. One case involved a veto of the legislative branch's budget. One of the first things the legislature does when it comes into session is pass a bill to provide its own funding for the legislative branch for the session and beyond. They can't operate without funding. And a couple of years ago, the current governor vetoed their funding. And so the legislature, instead of working with the governor to try to figure out what would get passed, came to us with an extraordinary writ petition saying the governor has destroyed our three branches of government because she has defunded an entire branch of government. She's destroyed an entire branch of government. We had Republicans and Democrats on the court, but we were unanimous in our decision that we couldn't grant that petition because the governor hadn't destroyed the branch of government. She just vetoed that particular appropriation. The legislature was still in session. They could have passed another one. And we had to think beyond this particular squabble over this particular veto and not get into deciding ourselves whether the governor's veto was reasonable or unreasonable, whether the legislature's funding request was reasonable or unreasonable. That's not a judicial function. And we had to think beyond the particular dispute. I like to say that we have to be smarter than our dogs because I have a dog that just chases cars whenever she's not on a leash and goes after the car fiercely. She's never caught one, but I often wonder what she would do if she did. We have to be smarter than the dog. We have to think what we're going to do if we make a decision, if we catch the car. If we had ruled in that case that we could overturn the veto of that legislative bill, what we'd be saying is that the legislature has the power to fund itself in any amount, and the governor has no power to review that and exercise the veto that's laid out in the state constitution. That would be the next step beyond if we decided the case that way. Most of the people who were fighting about the issues involved in the close quarters squabble weren't thinking that far down the road. And so we received a lot of criticism from Democratic legislators who said we sided with the governor. We didn't. We sided with the law. The next year we had a case that came up where the governor had failed to veto bills properly. The state constitution requires that a veto contain the reasons for the veto so the legislature can send up an amended bill and address the problem if they choose to. The governor didn't bother to do it for the first time in the history of our state. That came up to us, again, with a court of mixed political background. We again unanimously decided this time that the vetoes were invalid. It wasn't because we were taking sides of Democrats against a Republican, just as we hadn't been taking the side of a Republican governor against the Democratic legislature the year before. It was because of the principles of the law involved. And I think if you look at our opinions over the years, you'll see the evidence to support my own conclusion from the inner workings of the court that we try very hard not to make any decisions on a partisan political basis. It doesn't mean to say that we're without our own philosophical constructs, things that are of more value to us. There are those of us who believe more in the power of government, others more in the freedom of the individual, but that's the kind of normal range of philosophies that you'll have among citizens and lawyers and otherwise, and judges are no exception. But we try to put that aside to the extent possible when we're construing the laws that have been enacted by our people through our democratic process. One of the most important things I've learned is to think thoughts and not words. In fact, I use that phrase in a couple of opinions. Plato, in his book Phaedrus, has a passage in there where that is a discussion about whether writing words down impairs your ability to think. And I think sometimes it does, because we will try to capture a concept in words and write it on paper, and then we almost become a captive of the words. We end up interpreting the words rather than what the context of the situation was when those words were written into a constitution or a statute, and how that applies to the dispute before us. Instead, we focus on the words and try to interpret the words in the abstract to decide the present case. A good example is a case decided earlier this year involving the capital offense exception to the right to bail in our state constitution. Like most states in the country, when we became a state in 1912, our constitution had a right to bail in all cases except capital cases where the proof is evident or the presumption great. It's language that went back to Massachusetts and Pennsylvania charter language before the Revolutionary War and just got copied and pasted onto in constitution after constitution. Well, in 2009, the New Mexico legislature and the governor repealed capital punishment. But in the statute, they still had first-degree murder, which now carried a non-capital punishment of life without parole. They still called it a capital offense. And a judge had been hearing a detention motion on a defendant under the new constitutional provision allowing detention on clear and convincing evidence of dangerousness. And so I don't need to do that because this defendant is charged with murder and the statute says that's a capital offense, and therefore under the Constitution, this defendant doesn't have a right to bail at all. And if we would decide this just based on the use of the word in the statute and the similar word in the Constitution, we would have had to agree with the judge. But we had to think beyond that and think, what was the intent in using the term capital offenses in the Constitution? And researching history, which is one of the interesting part of our jobs, we found that throughout history, the term capital offenses had been an exception to bail because the theory was if you were facing the extinction of your life, there's no amount of money that would keep you around to meet the executioner. And again, thinking beyond the current situation, thinking what these dogs would do if they caught the car. If we were to say that the legislature could comply with that constitutional limitation on denial of bail, then that would enable the legislature to categorize any offense as capital if it weren't tied to some external concept like capital punishment as it historically had been. They could make shoplifting a capital offense carrying a 10-day jail sentence if they chose to, and therefore justify the denial of bail. Those would have been the inevitable consequences if we thought words rather than thoughts and got to the essence of what it was that was in mind with the adoption of that constitutional provision. You know, there's a big fight that always goes on when they're picking a new U.S. Supreme Court justice, which has become a very politicized event, regardless of what people use as justifications for supporting or opposing particular candidates. Look at the last two nominees, for example, or two of the last three. Merrick Garland never got a hearing in the Senate. Virtually all the Democrats wanted a hearing. Virtually all the Republicans didn't. They all had stated justifications for doing it, but it really was because it was our team versus their team. And in this last one, we saw a lot of arguments about whether or not Brett Kavanaugh should be on the Supreme Court or not. And they all focused on various things about his temperament or his prior behavior, and I'm not going to get into the debates on that. But I will tell you, if you pull back and look at the big picture, do you think it's a coincidence that all the Democrats were on one side of those issues, those arguments, and all the Republicans were on the other side? I don't think it's a coincidence at all. That kind of political consideration, I think, causes people to lose faith in the judicial system. Another example of looking down the road came up in another landmark case we decided, the Elaine photography case. New Mexico has a public accommodation statute that started out prohibiting discrimination based on race and religion and so on in public accommodations. Some categories were later added, including gender and sexual preference. They all define the definition of public accommodations applied to all of them. This case involved a wedding photographer. A same-sex couple was going to have a marriage ceremony and wanted to hire the photographer to do the wedding. The photographer said, same-sex marriages are against my religion. I won't do it. There was an action brought under the public accommodations statute, and the lower courts upheld the application of the statute. It came up before us, and one of the primary arguments that the photographer's lawyers was making was that this was a religious freedom issue. It would impose upon the religious freedom of the photographer to require them to accept the same-sex couple as customers. And it's an issue that a lot of people have disagreements about, and a lot of religions have disagreements about. But you know, the courts can't judge the validity of religious beliefs, can't judge the rationality of them. That's really hands-off. People have an absolute right to believe as they do in their religions. But there are certain things you can do to avoid the consequences of actions based on those beliefs. There was a case that was decided when I was in law school over 50 years ago called Loving versus Virginia, where the United States Supreme Court struck down a criminal conviction of a married couple whose crime was marrying someone of a different color skin. The marriage of a person with no trace of African blood with a person with a trace of African blood under a Virginia anti-miscegenation statute. The sentencing judge in that case, in what probably was an expression of his sincere religious belief, because he wasn't the only one in this country who's voiced this, said this when he sentenced the two of them to a year in jail. Almighty God created the races, white, black, yellow, Malay, and red, and he placed them on separate continents. And but for the interference with this arrangement, there would be no cause for such marriages. The fact that he separated the races shows that he did not intend for the races to mix and impose this sentence. Now, there's nothing we can do under the law to tell that judge his religious views are wrong or sanction him for doing it. But the U.S. Supreme Court said that religious belief can't deprive these people of their rights under the law. And they struck down that and all similar statutes. The same public accommodations ordinance statute in New Mexico that applies to discrimination based on sexual preference is the same one that applies to race. If we were to have created a religious exception to a public accommodation, it was stipulated by all parties that this photography studio was holding itself out as a public accommodation. If we would have created a religious belief exception, there's no principal distinction we can make under the statute for not allowing people with the religious beliefs of that Virginia judge to say, I'm not going to provide photographic services for an interracial marriage, or I'm not going to sell my biscuits to someone who's married to someone of a different race, because that's against my religion. And so we certainly knew the decision was going to be controversial in some quarters, and it continues to be so. But looking back on it now, I can't see how we could have decided any other way, and it, of course, was a unanimous decision. I've talked about politics and justice. I really think they mix about as well as water and oil. Despite the fact we have some inevitable aspects of politics in our selection and retention systems, I think we need to get politics as much as possible out of judicial selection and retention, including that one required political election after the initial appointment. It results in undoing the work of the merit selection process. It results in decisions that are made not based on merit, not based on performance, not based on competency to do the job, but factors that are totally irrelevant to whether someone would be a good judge. In fact, the two factors that are most relevant to being a good judge are the ones that are least relevant in whether you succeed in a political election. That is, your qualifications for the job and your performance once you're in it. Anybody who studies election results, judicial election results in New Mexico, will have to conclude that those two factors make no difference in almost all cases in whether a judge gets elected or retained in the political elections. I'm not talking about the retention non-political elections that are truly based on performance and where there's information available to the voters. There's an old saying that in theory there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. And I think that applies here. The theory of having people, having the judges required to submit to a partisan election is that it recognizes the power of the people to make their own choices. If people were making the decisions based on qualifications and performance, that theory would pan out. But the fact is the decisions are being made on the basis of party labels. Try running in Taos County as a Republican for district court. Try running in Lee County as a Democrat for the district court. You might as well think you can spread wings and fly as to think you can succeed in those kinds of things. And it affects courts throughout the state. The political party designation, the strength of that political party in a particular election, the coattails bearer at the top of the ticket, the governor or the president, how they're doing in the race will affect all the downstream low information races. And as much as anybody might want to think you're hot stuff having a job in the Court of Appeals of the Supreme Court, let me disabuse you of that notion. The public knows very little about what we do, how well we do it, what our qualifications are, and what that pithy phrase was in that last opinion you wrote. It has nothing to do with whether you're going to be elected or not. And so we really ought to get rid of that. I think there's going to be some renewed effort to do that. Ultimately, I think it tarnishes the public respect for the court. A final thought, and I think I'm probably running out of time here, is the importance of self-regulating on the part of the court. I've been struck by the awesome power, raw power, that we have as Supreme Court justices, as the final voice in what our statutes and constitutions say. We could construe our state laws as saying that everybody has to wear green on Tuesdays. And there's no court that has the power to overturn that. I mean, nobody has the power to regulate our interpretation of the Constitution and statutes, and there's no way to do that except by our own self-restraint. There are lines between the legislative and executive and judicial branches. Which branch has the responsibility of enforcing those lines and making sure one branch doesn't go over, just as we did in the legislative vetoes case. It's our branch. But nobody has a right to oversee what we've defined as whether or not we've transgressed a line or not. So it requires more self-restraint and self-regulation on our part than any legislator or governor has, because they always have a court looking over their shoulder. And I think the people I've served with in my 11 years have been very conscious of that. We often discuss it about the need to make sure we don't go over the line of our own authority, because by doing that, we destroy the structure of our self-government. And so it's really important to recognize those lines. I know there have been cases before us where people have been frustrated because we didn't create a new constitutional right for something or other that they thought was important in concept. And a lot of the things they've talked about, I've agreed, have been important. It'd be nice to have in the law. But we have to remember that when we create a new constitutional right, what we're doing then is saying the people have no power to decide otherwise without going through the cumbersome process of changing the wording of the Constitution. They can't go back to the legislators and pass a new statute. They can't go to their lawmaking representatives and change that result. We're essentially chiseling into stone a limit on the power of the people to go through their lawmaking branches to try to change the laws that govern their lives. And I'll give you a good example of that. I may have mentioned that the last time I was here. We had a case that came before us where there was an argument that the Constitution prohibited application of the criminal assisting suicide statute to a doctor who assisted suicide or who was thinking about assisting suicide of terminally ill patients. I held my mother's hand as she died an agonizing death. And if there had been a law that gave a doctor the right to help her go out peacefully and gently, she and I both would have wanted that. But there was no law that would provide that. If I were a legislator, frankly, I've never said this publicly, but if I were a legislator, I would vote in favor of such a provision. I think Hamlet's question, to be or not to be, is essentially an individual question when it comes down to it. But again, you have to think about what's going to happen when you catch the car. If you declare such a right, you have to define it. I asked the attorneys arguing the case for the doctor, what provisions would you have us say the Constitution would require on this right? They've been talking about the fact that a few states have passed statutes, like Oregon is a good example. In Oregon, there's a statute that says if two doctors certify that a patient is terminally ill, has less than 6 months to live, a mental health counselor certifies that the person is capable of making a rational and sane decision, and several other requirements, then the doctor can provide drugs to help end the patient's life and end the misery. And the lawyer representing the doctor said, well, you could adopt the provisions in the Oregon statute. I asked, so that means that we would say our state constitution, which has never addressed this issue, prohibits the legislature from making a crime in all those circumstances. Does that mean that if they pass a statute saying there have to be 3 doctors, that would be unconstitutional? What about 1 doctor? What about if the person is in horrible, horrible pain and agony, and instead of 6 months, is going to have a year of it? What about in that situation? Does the Constitution protect the right to assist suicide in that Constitution if we adopt the Oregon limitations? And went through all those kinds of provisions. once you chisel those into the constitutional interpretation, then the legislature can't do the kind of regulation that a lot of these complex matters really require. So part of our self-limitation is recognizing that we shouldn't go around with like a magic wand creating constitutional rights here or there, because every time we do it, we're taking power away from a self-governing people. And I'll end by just saying goodbye to you, thanking you all for the many courtesies you've shown me. It's been a wonderful experience on the court. I never had this in my game plan, if I ever had a game plan in life. In fact, I've had people recommend that I serve in the judiciary over the years, and I always told them, I'm having a great time being a player. I don't want to be a referee. And it was only after going to Justice Pamela Menzner's memorial service that I was struck by what a great thing she had done for other people by her service on the court. And I was of a sufficient age that I thought I could do without spending all my remaining days as a player in the lawyer field, and decided to come on the court. And I don't regret the decision I made. It's been one of the great honors, privileges of my life. And I'll just end by saying, despite all that, I'm sure my successor will do just as good a job. We're all replaceable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justice Daniels, and what an honor it is to hear your thoughts as you're considering the end of your stay at the Supreme Court. We will definitely miss you. The whole state of New Mexico will miss you, and thank you for your service. So before we break for lunch, are there any questions for Justice Daniels? He has a little more time and can stay around a little bit for it. And I will walk around with the microphone. I'm going to put this one in front of you.
I think I have enough voice left to answer some questions. I'm sorry about this voice. There's no control I have over it, like a lot of other things in life.
Bruce.
And I'll be glad to be candid about the things I can be candid about. I can't talk about individual justices' views on individual issues that came before us, because we recognize the sanctity of our deliberation room like we respect the sanctity of the jury's deliberation room.
Yes, Justice Daniels, I'm sure a lot of people here have appreciated your comments whenever you've shown up at these conferences about the judicial function. And I know that you've been in some cases that involved appeals from the Public Regulation Commission. There's currently an ongoing debate about whether they should change the way the folks that serve as commissioners on that commission get to that position. They're currently, as you know, now elected. And I would just, I hope that even though you're retiring, if they have that debate, if you have an opportunity to go to the legislature and explain to the legislators what that function is when they preside over quasi-judicial type cases as opposed to rulemakings, that if you have the opportunity, if you could share your views with them about generally just the function, I think it might be helpful.
I'm going to be more free to express my views as a citizen. You know, there's a figure of the Lady of Justice with a blindfold over her eyes that really ought to be a few inches lower. It's a gag over our mouths. We can see, but we can't speak about a lot of the things we see, and shouldn't, because they're decisions that really aren't ours to be making, like how we select those commissioners, whether we have long or short ballot elections in New Mexico. Our job is to stand back while the lawmaking representatives of the people decide those issues, and then we interpret their thoughts and words in the way we think They legitimately express them. And so whenever we go to the legislature, it's almost exclusively on it is exclusively on matters affecting the function of the judiciary, like the bail reform amendment. That really got to the heart of judicial functions. Our judges had their hands tied in protecting community safety without blinding themselves to the oath they took to enforce that broad constitutional right to bail. And they were forced with a choice of on a daily basis of following the oath of their office and letting a dangerous person bail out, or by violating the law and using the setting of bail as a pretext for keeping somebody from getting out in the first place. That really hit to the heart of the judicial function. So we took a leading role in that issue, one of the more important things we've worked on in my time in the court. As a citizen, I can't say anything now, but I predict what I would freely express on January 1, after 1 minute after midnight, when I will lapse into retirement while I'm slumbering safely. I think the long ballot is a bad idea for judicial offices, for offices like that. I guarantee you can go knock on every door in any block in this town or any town in the state and ask people about the qualifications of the commissioners they voted for on this last election, and virtually none of them will know anything. The same applies to a lot of the other offices, the county assessor, state treasurer, offices like that, the Supreme Court, Court of Appeals. The federal model, while not perfect, at least allows the executive that the people elect, and they do focus on the qualifications for president and governor and so on, that those people do some vetting and selecting of people who at least meet minimal qualifications, maybe with the backstop of a legislative confirmation. That would be a much more sensible function for a lot of those offices. You get together and set up a business. You don't have your customers vote on who's going to be designing your products or these things. You go out and try to find the best people you can to get your mission accomplished. I think that works in government too. So that's what I would tell you on January 1st. But I'm not going to do it yet because I'm not speaking out on things that aren't my business.
Justice Daniels, I'm sure people have asked you this, and if you don't want to answer it, obviously that's fine. I'm curious whether, looking back on your career on the Supreme Court, are there particular cases, particular decisions that you feel most proud of?
Most what?
Proud, happy about. Feel like you really poured yourself into it.
Yeah, there are several of them. While I'm on the subject of bail reform, the opinion I authored in State versus Brown in 2014 really took a serious, cold, hard look at how we ended up with a system of pretrial release and detention based not on individual evidence of risk, and a system that's based on evidence in making decisions, not based on evidence of individual risk of flight or danger, but based on how much money you could put in the pockets of a commercial bonding company. And that issue came up to our court a few years ago and caused us to say, how in the world did we end up with this system? How did our country end up with it? And it was a wonderful case to research and write, because we traced it back to the tribes in England and in mainland Europe before the Norman Conquest, where there was no crime against the sovereign. Criminal activity was dealt with like we would deal with civil cases. Compensation had to be made to the victim and their families. And relatives or neighbors or friends of the accused would stand good for the damages that had to be paid at the end of the case. That was the origin of money bail, and it made sense. You have somebody stand good for the person till it all got worked out. Well, after the Norman Conquest in 1066 and the consolidation of power in a single king of England, the notion developed that criminal acts were not only an offense against the victim that was compensable, they were also crimes against the sovereign, the king, which our present government substitutes for. And they kept that system of money bail, supposedly as a guarantee that the person would show up for trial. And in the Magna Carta, right to bail basically was preserved in 1165. And it got passed down to us through that process. It was just fascinating, tracing how this has evolved and morphed over the years. And when we became a nation, we adopted that English system of sureties, having people say, I'll stand good for them. They didn't put up money in advance. They just swore their lands and their chattels to guarantee that the person would stand good to answer the judgment. It wasn't until about 1900, late 1800s, in a saloon in San Francisco, that someone started selling bail bonds. Contrary to what the bail industry will tell you, it's not something that's been with us since the beginning of this country. The requirement of sureties has been, but commercial sale of bail bonds really started over 100 years after we became a nation. And so we traced how all that had transpired and how it had morphed into a huge industry in the 1900s and was growing rapidly as we wrote the opinion and was endangering public safety and was resulting in the unequal administration of justice. The opinion was a bombshell, both in New Mexico and elsewhere. I got calls from judges from all around the country about it because a lot of other jurisdictions are waking up to the dysfunction of this kind of money-based release and detention system. But ironically, we didn't create a single new word of law in that Brown opinion. As long as it was, as comprehensive as it was descriptive. We traced how we got here. We traced the constitutional provisions, such as you can't use a setting of bail to keep someone from getting out. It's supposed to be to provide an additional guarantee that they will show up, at least in theory, as a result of the money that's on the table. And all the opinion that was described, the controlling principles of law, and remind our judges what they were, because judges throughout the state were basing the amounts of money they posted on factors other than individual risk. So that's one of the opinions I'm happiest about. There have been several others that I wrote. I wrote an opinion on the historical origins in New Mexico of whether a pocket knife was a deadly weapon. It sounds like a trivial issue, and in the big scheme of things, it probably is, except to that little boy, a high school student, who had a pocket knife in his jeans that he'd worn in the hardware store the night before, where he was opening boxes, and ended up getting prosecuted for carrying a deadly weapon onto school grounds, without regard to his remembering he had it on him, or his intent in using it as a weapon. And it was an interesting search through history to find out how that got into the law. Ultimately said it does depend on intent. Sometimes it's a tool, just like it is on the workman's belt when he goes to pick up his kids at school. It can be used as a weapon, just as a brick or a steel-toed shoe can be used as a weapon, or a history book can be used as a weapon, but they're not inherently prohibited deadly weapons. There have been a few others. I traced character evidence back to the Egyptian pharaohs, to a scrap of papyrus 2,000 years BC, and that was a fascinating thing, tracing back the origins of the concept of character evidence and its limitations in our law. There have been a number of other cases that I wasn't the author of that I think were important. The marriage cases, the same gender marriage cases, which our court had, I think, a year or two before the U.S. Supreme Court came up with the same result on similar issues. But that was an important case because our state attached various state-created rights and disabilities based on whether or not you're married. You got tax breaks if you're married. If you were in a similarly committed relationship but didn't have an official marriage certificate from the state, you didn't get the tax breaks. Inheritance rights, all kinds of other benefits and disabilities of the law were provided depending on whether you got their certificate, but you couldn't get one unless you were in a committed relationship of two opposite sexes. And we struck that down. That was unconstitutional under our state constitution. Justice Chavez wrote that opinion. It was a great opinion. I could probably go on and on about cases that I'm glad I got to participate in. Not that any one of them dramatically changed the world. As I drive back and forth to my Albuquerque home, I look out, I don't see New Mexico looking any different as a result of the cases we decided on our court. As Justice Baca told me once when I ran into him at a restaurant, he said, one thing you'll find out is after you retire is that all that stuff we thought that was so important, we justices were fighting about it, most of it wasn't really that important after all.
Well, we think it is actually very important. And not only that, Justice Daniels, you're being very humble because, I mean, there are people in same-sex marriages who would not be in those marriages without the decision that you all took. There are people who are out on bail who wouldn't be out there without the decisions that you took. And I want you to know how much your participation on the court, your wisdom, your interest in history, your reasoning are appreciated by the people of this state. And we have been honored at this conference to have you speak with us, to us, several times. And each time it has been a moving and important experience for all of us. And once again, we want to say thank you. And we hope you enjoy your retirement.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you all.
So there are lunches outside, I think, in the hall for folks. Please take your lunch. We will start again at 1:30 and enjoy the next 40 minutes of your own. Was that your telephone that you have? You got it?
Yeah, put it on.
I didn't want to concur. That's exactly a great honor for your audience and for all of us to have you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
George,